Hello to all you fans of all things weird, dark, and mysterious told through stories. If you enjoy tales that make your hair stand on end and keep you awake all night, you've come to the right place. Because today's story, oh, this is absolutely insane. But before we begin, please invite the like button to a romantic dinner, but when the bill comes, you pretend to go to the bathroom and escape out the window. After that, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there?
On the morning of November 1st, 2002, a 54-year-old man named Lonnie Turner stood inside the back room of a funeral home, carefully trimming the hair on a dead man's head. Lonnie was the owner and head mortician of the Jones Funeral Home in Navasota, Texas, which is a small town just north of Houston. Lonnie had already drained the blood from the body and filled its veins with embalming fluid. Once he wrapped up the haircut, he dressed the body and then applied makeup, before moving it into its casket for the wake that afternoon. When he was done, Lonnie headed down the hallway and up the steps to his office. The whole time he walked, his feet ached. Lonnie was only 54, but lately, he'd been feeling exhausted from his job, and from all the volunteering he did outside of work. As he reached the sitting area outside his office, he looked at the photos that lined the walls. There were pictures of Lonnie with the town mayor, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Navasota School Board. He was the first African-American member of the Navasota City Council, and just 2 years ago, he'd received the Citizen of the Year award from the Chamber of Commerce. The plaque hung on the wall just outside his office, and every time he looked at it, he felt a swell of pride. But when he went into his office, Lonnie's smile quickly faded. Because his 21-year-old son, Junior, was sitting in Lonnie's chair with his feet up on Lonnie's desk, talking loudly nonstop into his cell phone. Lonnie tried to get his son's attention, but Junior just clearly ignored him. So Lonnie just stood there, arms crossed, giving his son a very stern look. Finally, Junior stopped talking on the phone and turned to face his dad. But instead of saying hello to him, he told his dad that he was about to register for the Texas Mortuary Law Exam, which he had to pass to get his mortician's license. And getting that license was the very first step for Junior to be able to take over the family business, something Lonnie was all too aware of. Now, Lonnie knew part of Junior probably just wanted to get out of his father's shadow. It had to be hard sometimes when your father was one of the most well-known people in town, but as much as Lonnie did want to hand over the funeral business to his son, he wasn't going to do that until he felt certain that his son could actually handle it. Because currently, his son acted really immature basically all the time. And so instead of Lonnie reacting to what his son had just told him about taking this mortuary exam, Lonnie just said, okay, well, there's still work to be done here at the funeral home. And then before Junior could protest, he told him he had to move their latest client's coffin into the chapel for the wake, he needed to order more embalming fluid, and get the company car washed. Then Lonnie threw the car keys to his son, and after Junior grabbed him, he just stood up and stormed out of the office looking totally annoyed. But Lonnie didn't care. He was tired of his son's bad attitude and entitled behavior, and he knew he needed to be tougher on Junior. If he didn't, he felt like Junior's habit of being sort of lazy could land him in serious trouble. Just then, Lonnie heard voices coming from outside of his office. He peeked into the hallway, and he saw his son talking to another young man. It was 19-year-old James White, Lonnie's godson. James had grown up around Lonnie's family, and had always looked at Lonnie like an uncle, and at Junior like an older brother. Now, James worked part-time at the funeral home with both of them. But as Lonnie listened to this conversation that was going on, he realized his son was telling James to do several of the tasks that Lonnie had literally just assigned him. And he'd caught Junior doing this before, paying James extra to do work he wanted to avoid, and taking advantage of the fact that James looked up to him and would basically do whatever he asked. And this made Lonnie furious, because he didn't give Junior tasks just to keep him busy. They were a way of preparing him to take over this business. For Lonnie, this was just further proof that his son was not ready for serious responsibility. Lonnie sighed, but he didn't confront his son or James. He just let them do their work and then told them to leave early. Once they were gone, Lonnie spent the afternoon making preparations for upcoming funerals and speaking to grieving family members. By the time he could finally head home, he was totally exhausted. After locking up the funeral home, Lonnie drove through downtown Navasota towards a small neighborhood at the edge of town. When he pulled up in front of his big 2-story house, it was dark outside. He parked and walked around the house to the back porch. The light was on, and the back door was unlocked, just like Lonnie always left it. He went inside and noticed that Junior wasn't home yet. Lonnie assumed he was out with his friends, like usual. So Lonnie just turned on the TV and made himself some dinner. He ate, watched some local news, and then spoke to a client on the phone around 9:15. They talked for a few minutes, and then after that, Lonnie headed to bed. And he was so tired from work that day that he fell asleep pretty much immediately. And he was sleeping soundly when suddenly there was this loud creaking noise that woke him up. Lonnie sat upright in bed, confused, and before his eyes could adjust to the darkness, he heard something else. The sound of breathing. Someone else was in the room with him. A couple hours later, just before midnight, Lonnie's son, Junior, pulled into the driveway outside the house. As always, he walked around to the back porch as well. But when he got there, he noticed the porch light wasn't on, and it typically was. And so he checked the bulb and actually found that it was slightly unscrewed. So he tightened it until the light came back on. After that, he opened the unlocked door and went inside. He headed upstairs to his bedroom, but on the way there, he noticed his father's bedroom door was open. Now, his dad always slept with the door shut, and it wasn't like him to be up this late. So Junior called out and asked if everything was okay, but there was no response. So Junior walked closer to the open door and peeked inside. But when he did, he saw his dad was not in bed. Instead, Lonnie was lying on the floor beside the bed, perfectly still. And on the wall above him was a huge, dark red streak of blood. Junior just stared for a moment in shock, and then immediately turned and sprinted to his bedroom. There he lifted up his mattress, revealing a collection of handguns, and he grabbed one at random. He jammed the gun into the waistband of his pants and then fled down the stairs. Junior burst through the back door, jumped into his car, and started speeding towards the nearest police station. As he drove, he used his cell phone to call 911. When the dispatcher asked what the emergency was, Junior told them his dad had been shot and killed. When they asked if he had checked for a pulse, he admitted that he hadn't. He said he'd left in a hurry because he was scared whoever had killed his dad might still be in the house. While Junior was speeding to the police station, an officer named Rob Bailey was patrolling the town. It had been a quiet night, that is until his radio crackled, and dispatch told him that a deadly shooting had just been reported at an address on the edge of town, and the shooter might still be inside the building. And Officer Bailey immediately recognized the address, because, like most officers on the Navasota police force, he knew Lonnie and the entire Turner family personally. And so he sped to Lonnie's house, praying that his friend was okay. When he got there, he parked and headed straight to the backyard, because he knew Lonnie always went in through his back door. But while he was rounding the house, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. The lights were on downstairs, and he could see someone moving around inside. Now, part of Officer Bailey hoped that this shadowy figure was Lonnie himself, and that despite the report of a deadly shooting here, that Lonnie was somehow okay. But he knew that wasn't likely. More likely was this shadowy figure was the shooter. And so with his hand on his sidearm, Officer Bailey carefully walked to the back porch and knocked on the back door. There was a long moment of silence, then he heard footsteps from inside. The door opened, and when Officer Bailey saw who was standing there, he was confused. He recognized the man. But it wasn't Lonnie Turner. It was Lonnie's brother, Lawson, which was very unusual because the officer knew that Lawson lived almost 3 hours away. And as for Lawson, he also looked confused to be seeing a police officer standing at the door. And when Officer Bailey told him that he was actually here responding to a possible shooting, Lawson looked even more bewildered. He said he didn't know anything about a shooting and said he had only arrived a few minutes ago and found the house totally empty. Officer Bailey didn't know what to make of that, but he asked Lawson to please wait outside, and then Officer Bailey went into the house. Bailey went straight to Lonnie's bedroom, and there, just as Junior had described it, he would find Lonnie Turner laying on the ground beside the bed, with the wall streaked with blood behind him. Bailey leaned down to check his friend for a pulse, but there wasn't one. Officer Bailey just stood there for a moment, struggling to process the fact that his friend and one of the most respected men in the city was dead, most likely murdered. A moment later, Officer Bailey collected himself and radioed for backup. After that, he remembered that he had a possible suspect waiting outside. Officer Bailey rushed downstairs and out into the backyard. Lawson seemed eager for news about whatever was going on, but Officer Bailey wasn't sure how much he should say. He was a patrol officer, not a homicide investigator, so he was kind of out of his depth. But he still felt like he had to do something. So he asked Lawson what he was doing at his brother's house. Lawson said he was on his way to Houston, and he was planning to spend the night at his brother's house to break up the drive. He said he'd gotten to the house just a few minutes before Officer Bailey did, and when he'd gone inside, he'd called out for Lonnie, but no one had answered. He'd even looked in Lonnie's bedroom and didn't see him, so he figured Lonnie was out dealing with some funeral home business and would be back soon. And listening to this, Officer Bailey literally couldn't believe what Lawson was saying. The walls in Lonnie's bedroom were literally covered in blood, and his brother's body was literally laying on the floor in front of him. It didn't make sense that Lawson could have looked inside that room and not noticed those things. So even though Officer Bailey was not a detective and was not in charge of this case, he wanted to see how Lawson would react to the news of his brother's death. So he just came right out and told him. And when he did, Lawson looked shocked and then totally devastated, and then he broke down sobbing. Officer Bailey watched him, trying to judge if his tears were genuine, but he couldn't tell. But just then, Officer Bailey looked up and saw headlights approaching the house. Detective Travis Higginbotham parked in Lonnie's driveway. Higginbotham worked for the district attorney's office and had been appointed as the lead investigator on this case. He already knew that the murder of a local celebrity would garner plenty of attention, and also the fact that the Texas Rangers, who were the state police, had been called in to help on this case only made it more high profile. And so for Detective Higginbotham, he knew this case could either make his career or break it. Higginbotham got out of his car and met up with Officer Bailey in the backyard, and he was surprised to see another man was sitting outside and crying. Officer Bailey quickly explained the situation, and the detective agreed that Lawson seemed suspicious. But before Higginbotham could even begin to think about that, he needed to go inside and survey the crime scene. He went to Lonnie's bedroom and took note of the trajectory of the blood spatter on the walls. Then he examined Lonnie's body, and the detective found 2 bullet casings from a 9mm pistol nearby. Given the location of the wounds and the fact that there was no gun anywhere in the room, it was fairly obvious this couldn't be a suicide. So Detective Higginbotham started looking around for clues about a possible motive for murder. Nothing in Lonnie's bedroom, or the rest of the house for that matter, had been disturbed. Lonnie's wallet and his watch were out in plain sight, and there was also $7,000 in cash in an unlocked safe. So it didn't seem like the motive for this was robbery. There were also no signs of a break-in, which made sense considering Lonnie kept his back door unlocked. But that also meant whoever killed Lonnie likely knew in advance he did not lock his back door. So it seemed like a working theory was whoever killed Lonnie knew him personally and maybe had some kind of vendetta against him. As he was thinking this over, Detective Higginbotham heard Lonnie's brother, Lawson, still sobbing outside in the yard. And so Higginbotham got up and headed out to question him. Lawson was clearly distraught, and he started by just repeating everything he'd already told Officer Bailey. And like Officer Bailey, Detective Higginbotham found his story to be very suspicious. The idea he looked in his brother's room and didn't notice his brother's body or the blood on the wall just didn't make any sense. So Higginbotham leaned forward and asked Lawson a much more pointed question. Did he own a gun? Without hesitating, Lawson said yes. He actually had it in his car right now. Lawson led Detective Higginbotham to his car and pointed at a pistol that was just sitting out in the back seat. But the detective saw right away the gun was a .32, not a 9mm, so it very likely was not the murder weapon. But Higginbotham did not think that proved Lawson was innocent, so he decided to bring him to the station, not for more questioning, but for a test. Once they were at the police station, Higginbotham had Lawson's hands swabbed for gunshot residue. The idea was to see if he had fired a gun recently, like that evening. But the results came back negative. Lawson did not have gunshot residue on his hands. However, that didn't totally rule out the possibility that he had fired a gun that evening, because Lawson could have fired a gun with gloves on. Or he could have just vigorously washed his hands afterwards. And so because Detective Higginbotham didn't have any other evidence against Lawson, he had to let him go for now. But the detective was not totally disappointed, because he had another person of interest waiting for him right down the hall. In a nearby interview room, a Texas Ranger was already questioning Lonnie's son, Junior. Detective Higginbotham joined their session and began observing Junior's behavior. Unlike Lawson, who'd been devastated by his brother's death, Junior seemed strangely calm. And his story also seemed very suspicious. According to Junior, when he'd seen the blood on his dad's wall, he had immediately assumed that his dad was shot and killed, even though he didn't hear gunshots or see shell casings, and he didn't check to see if his dad still had a pulse. Junior claimed this was all just gut instinct, but Detective Higginbotham thought it sounded more like Junior already knew what had happened before he'd ever stepped foot into his father's room. But again, Junior swore that was not true. He said he'd been terrified that whoever had shot his dad was still in the house, so he grabbed one of his own guns to protect himself, and then to prove his story, Junior pulled a handgun from his belt and placed it on the table. Higginbotham was stunned. Civilians were not supposed to be allowed to bring weapons into police stations. The detective didn't even know how Junior managed to get the gun inside. But regardless, Junior having a gun during his interview definitely did not make him look any less guilty. However, when Detective Higginbotham took a closer look at the weapon, he saw it was not a 9mm. But still, if Junior owned an arsenal of handguns, the detective figured there could be a 9mm in there somewhere. So, just to be safe, Detective Higginbotham also had Junior's hands swabbed for gunshot residue. And this time, the test came back positive, which would typically mean that Junior fired a weapon that night. But, once again, the results were inconclusive, because in theory, Junior could have gotten that residue on his hands simply by handling the pistol he brought into the station. Higginbotham was weighing this possibility when he got a call from the team of investigators who were still collecting evidence at the crime scene. They'd just found the cache of guns under Junior's mattress, and one of them was a 9mm pistol. Now, it would have to be tested against the shell casings found at the crime scene, which would take time, but it could be the murder weapon. And when Higginbotham confronted Junior about this, Junior's response shocked the detective, because Junior claimed that that specific 9mm gun had actually disappeared from his collection several weeks ago. He had no idea how it had gotten back under his mattress. To the detective, this excuse sounded ridiculous, but he asked Junior if, when the gun went missing, did you report it missing? And Junior said no. At this point, Junior's story seemed to be getting flimsier and flimsier. But one thing prevented Detective Higginbotham from arresting him on the spot. Junior claimed to have an alibi. He said he had spent most of the night hanging out with his girlfriend. They ate at a restaurant, then headed to her place for a few hours, and then on his way home after the date, he stopped at a car wash. Higginbotham wrote down Junior's girlfriend's name, as well as the name of the car wash, so he could look into the alibi later. In the meantime, he let Junior go, but promised they would speak again soon. The next morning, Detective Higginbotham made several calls to verify Junior's alibi, and pretty much everything Junior had said checked out. He'd definitely been to his girlfriend's house and the car wash, but there were still small gaps in his schedule where he theoretically could have had time to go home and kill his dad. The detective sighed. Junior and Lawson both had such unbelievable stories. He was sure one of them was lying, but he just couldn't tell which one. Just then, the phone on Detective Higginbotham's desk rang. It was the district attorney, and he had big news. A police officer who'd been cataloging evidence at Lonnie's house had gone on a smoke break, and when he did, he found a pair of gloves and a makeshift mask lying in a creek just 25 yards from Lonnie's front door. Detective Higginbotham's eyes went wide. He knew that if Lonnie's killer had worn that mask, it would probably still carry trace amounts of their saliva, which would contain their DNA. Testing the mask for DNA would take time, but it could potentially solve the case. Higginbotham ended the call feeling much more optimistic about the case. He arranged for DNA samples to be collected from Junior and Lawson so he could compare them to the mask. But almost as soon as the detective did that, he received another phone call. And this one sent him in a totally different direction. That call was from a Texas Ranger who said he'd done some digging, and he had discovered a criminal case involving Lonnie from a few months before his death. Apparently, a thief had stolen several blank checks from Lonnie's office, then made them out to himself, forged Lonnie's signature, and stole close to $8,000 from Lonnie's account. Lonnie found out and pressed charges. And because he pressed charges, this meant the police had copies of those fraudulent checks, and those checks had the thief's name written on them. The thief was Lonnie's 19-year-old godson, James White. After speaking to the Texas Ranger, Higginbotham asked around and learned that James White worked part-time at the funeral home. Evidently, Lonnie had forgiven him for the theft, but Detective Higginbotham didn't think that made James trustworthy. In fact, he thought that James could be just as strong of a suspect as Junior and Lawson. James was close to the family. He likely knew that Lonnie kept his back door unlocked. He also might have even known where Junior hid his guns. And so Detective Higginbotham knew he needed to question James immediately. So he made some calls, and before long, he managed to track James down. James seemed very upset about the death of his godfather, but he was very cooperative and answered all of the detective's questions. And he admitted to forging the checks, but vehemently denied any involvement in Lonnie's death. And like Junior, he had an alibi for the night of the murder. James said he had been at a club in a neighboring town with some friends who would all be able to confirm the story. Detective Higginbotham promised to contact them. Then he thought back to the mask that had been found outside of Lonnie's home, and he asked if James would be willing to provide a voluntary DNA sample. And right away, James said yes. Higginbotham collected a DNA sample from James and then headed back to the DA's office. When he got there, he sent James's DNA to be tested alongside the mask, just like Junior's and Lawson's. After that, he went into his office and he found a report on his desk. It was from the ballistics lab. They'd analyzed the shell casings from the crime scene and the 9mm pistol found under Junior's mattress, and they had confirmed what Detective Higginbotham already suspected. Junior's 9mm gun was in fact the murder weapon. Reading this, Detective Higginbotham was ready to arrest Junior right then, but when he asked the district attorney for approval, he said no. The DA said it was too early to make an arrest. With all the attention Lonnie's murder was getting, their case needed to be airtight. So before they made their move, they had to wait for the results of the DNA test on that mask. Detective Higginbotham knew there was always a chance the DNA test results could be inconclusive and get them nothing. So he continued to investigate his main suspects, and he kept an especially close eye on Junior. And in the weeks following his father's death, Junior went on a massive shopping spree with his inheritance. He bought an expensive boat and a luxury car, and he also hired a lawyer, even though he had not been charged with anything. This only made the detective more certain that Junior had to be guilty, and he was about to march into the DA's office and ask for permission to arrest Junior again, but he knew what they'd say. He would need more evidence. But then, 2 months after Lonnie's death, Higginbotham heard from a fellow detective that a different suspect was also behaving erratically. Lonnie's godson, James, had been caught trying to rob a bar, and during the robbery, he hit the owner of the bar with a cash register. Clearly, James was hard up for cash and willing to go to extreme and violent lengths to get it. With this, Detective Higginbotham found himself feeling totally overwhelmed by all the evidence against each of his potential suspects. However, all this evidence was kind of all over the place. He couldn't really put it all together. And so he went into his office, sat down at his desk, and went back over all the information he had about James, Lawson, and Junior. James was a known thief with access to Lonnie's house. He could have easily gotten inside and killed Lonnie during a robbery gone wrong. However, no valuables had been taken from the crime scene, which didn't seem to add up if the motive was burglary. Then there was Lawson. He was literally in the house when police arrived, and his story about looking in his brother's bedroom and not noticing the blood on the wall or the body on the ground was hard to believe. And finally, there was Junior. Junior owned the murder weapon and had gunshot residue on his hands on the night of the murder, and also the fact that he fled the crime scene before verifying that his father was actually dead still just didn't sit right with Detective Higginbotham. And most importantly, Junior stood to benefit the most from his father's death. With Lonnie out of the way, he inherited a significant amount of money and a successful funeral home business. And so Detective Higginbotham was sure he was so close to figuring out who killed Lonnie. And sure enough, just a few days later, the DNA test results from the mask came back. And when Higginbotham saw them, he knew the case was solved. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Lonnie Turner on the evening of November 1st, 2002. That night, sometime between 9:15 and 10 p.m., the killer drove into Lonnie's neighborhood with their headlights off. They parked outside of Lonnie's house, then put on their gloves and their mask, a mask they had made earlier by cutting holes in a gym shoe bag. Now, if all went according to their plan, no one would see them tonight. But if somebody did catch a glimpse of them, the killer could not afford to be recognized. And so as an extra safety measure, the killer grabbed a 9mm pistol that they'd brought with them, and then stepped out of the car and hurried towards the back of Lonnie's house. When they got to the porch, they reached up and unscrewed the porch light bulb just enough to break the circuit and kill the light. Then the killer reached for the doorknob, and as expected, it was unlocked. The killer headed inside and went straight for the master bedroom. They knew the thing they'd come here for was inside of that room. They reached the door, turned the knob, and carefully pushed the door open just a crack. The killer peeked inside. He saw Lonnie was lying in bed, snoring. The killer watched Lonnie for several seconds. They knew entering the room was risky, but at this point, they'd come too far to turn back now. So eventually, they pushed the door open further and began to go inside. However, the killer only got 1 foot into the bedroom before the door made a loud creaking sound. The killer froze. They looked over at the bed, and to their horror, Lonnie stopped snoring, sat up suddenly, and looked right over at them. For a moment, the two just stared at each other. The killer had no idea if Lonnie could recognize them with their mask on, but Lonnie looked like he was about to stand up and confront them, so in a panic, the killer raised their gun and fired. Lonnie screamed, and the killer immediately fired again, and Lonnie went limp and then rolled off the bed onto the ground. The killer was so shocked by what they'd done that they didn't even wait to see if Lonnie was dead. Instead, they just turned and ran out of the room, completely forgetting the thing they had come here for. And the killer was almost out the door and out of Lonnie's house when they realized they couldn't just flee the scene while carrying the murder weapon. So they ran back inside, went to another bedroom, lifted up the mattress, and dropped the gun underneath. After that, the killer sprinted out the back door, tore off their gloves and mask, tossed them in a nearby ditch, and then jumped into their car and sped away. In their panic, the killer never considered the fact that they had been breathing through that mask the entire time they were in the house. So they didn't realize that that mask was full of their DNA. And so if investigators got the mask, it would lead them directly to the killer. When Detective Higginbotham saw the DNA test results, he knew the killer was not Lonnie's son, Junior, who owned the murder weapon, and it wasn't Lonnie's brother, Lawson, who was in the house when police showed up. Instead, the killer was James White, Lonnie Turner's 19-year-old godson. James was desperate for money and willing to do just about anything to get it. And he'd been to Lonnie's house countless times, so he knew Lonnie kept the back door unlocked, and he kept a safe full of cash in the master bedroom. He also knew where Junior kept his gun collection. So James planned a robbery. He bought a pair of gloves and made that makeshift mask, and then 2 weeks before the murder, he stole the 9mm pistol from under Junior's mattress. Not because he wanted to kill Lonnie, but just in case anything went wrong. Finally, on the evening of November 1st, James put his plan into action. But when the bedroom door creaked and it woke Lonnie up, James knew he was caught. So he shot Lonnie in a panic and then ran away without even taking any money, even though Lonnie's safe, which contained $7,000 in cash, was sitting unlocked not far away. Which means James killed his godfather for nothing. James was arrested and quickly confessed to pulling the trigger. He also admitted that he'd convinced his friends to lie about his alibi. However, James insisted that the crime was not actually his idea. He claimed Lonnie's son, Junior, had literally forced him to commit the murder at gunpoint because Junior wanted his inheritance. However, there was no evidence suggesting that actually happened. Ultimately, James White would make a plea deal and received a 20-year sentence. On February 24, 2017, 28-year-old Shannon Graves sat on the couch watching TV with her boyfriend in her apartment in Youngstown, Ohio. Shannon changed the channel, and right away she could see that her boyfriend, who was a man in his early 30s named Arturo Novoa, looked annoyed by what she wanted to watch, so she flipped the channel to something else. Then Shannon glanced over at Arturo, but he still looked annoyed. Shannon sighed, trying her best to keep her cool. It was not that long ago that sitting on the couch with Arturo would have made for a relaxing evening at home. But now, every time the two were around each other, they just seemed to argue about everything, even meaningless stuff like what to watch on TV. Shannon put the remote down and then leaned back on the couch and didn't say anything. She hoped that maybe if she just sat there in silence, they could avoid a fight. But in reality, Shannon knew that this TV show she chose, or whatever little thing they ended up arguing about next, was actually just a symptom of a much bigger problem. Her and Arturo's relationship was clearly falling apart. The two of them met almost a year earlier at the club where Shannon had been working nights as a dancer while she went to classes during the day to earn her cosmetology degree. And despite their obvious differences, at first they had gotten along great. Shannon was outgoing and always seemed to be on the move, while Arturo was quiet and more reserved. But they thought their differences actually complemented each other really well. So, after dating for only a few months, Shannon and Arturo moved into an apartment together. And that's when things started to go bad. It was like right away, they just both stopped trusting each other. Arturo accused Shannon of still being into her ex-boyfriend, a guy she'd actually been living with before she met Arturo, and Shannon was convinced that Arturo had a thing for this woman who was always hanging around him when he would come to see Shannon at the club. But whether or not those things were true, Shannon knew her issues with the relationship ran deeper than just thinking Arturo might like some other girl. Shannon had always been someone who loved change. She just never wanted to feel stuck. And so to avoid that feeling, she would often do things like dye her long black hair green and blue, or she'd take much bigger steps, like she would occasionally just leave town for weeks at a time to go on an adventure by herself without telling anyone where she was. But living with Arturo had definitely made Shannon feel stuck. And over the last few months, that feeling had really worn her down. Back in the apartment, Shannon eventually just stood up from the couch and began to walk out of the room. But as she did, Arturo snapped at her for some reason, and then before long, the two of them were just yelling at each other. And the argument escalated, even though neither of them really knew what they were even fighting about. Until finally, Arturo said, maybe he should just leave for good. And then he stormed out. Shannon stood there in her apartment for a minute, trying to catch her breath and calm down. She was mad, but she also couldn't help but feel this sense of relief. If Arturo was gone, like really gone, she could now do anything she wanted. She could make a change. She could go someplace new. A few months earlier, Shannon had finally earned her cosmetology degree. She had worked really hard for it, and she was proud of herself. Some people had been surprised because they thought getting a degree sort of went against Shannon's need for constant change, but Shannon saw things differently. Her degree could open doors and give her a chance to work as a cosmetologist in different cities. Or maybe she could even become a highly sought-after makeup artist who would get to travel all over the world. But Arturo had never really supported her dreams, so she had kind of given up on them. Now she could start putting her degree and her talents to work, and she would not have to do that in Youngstown, Ohio. And just thinking about the possibilities for the future got her really excited. Shannon walked to the bathroom, got undressed, and turned on the shower. In her mind, she would wash off all the bad stuff that had happened recently, and it would be like the first small step towards a fresh start. On June 22nd, 2017, so 4 months after Shannon and Arturo had their big fight, Detective Mike Lambert of the Youngstown Police Department looked up from his desk, and he saw a uniformed police officer standing there with a woman who looked very pale and worried. Detective Lambert asked how he could help. The woman said her name was Debbie DePaul, and she needed to file a missing persons report. She said that nobody had seen or talked to her younger half-sister, Shannon Graves, in 4 months. A confused look came across Lambert's face, and for a second he thought he must have misheard her. And so he asked her again, how long has it been since anybody talked to your half-sister? And Debbie repeated herself and said again it had been 4 months. This blew Lambert away. In all his time as a detective, he'd seen family and friends typically file missing persons report If anything, too soon, like before they really needed to. Not 4 months after the fact. In fact, in the majority of cases he'd worked, the supposed missing person had turned up before the cops could even launch a real search. So he really couldn't understand why Debbie, or anyone else close to Shannon, had waited this long to talk to the police. Lambert told the other officer he could leave, and he asked Debbie to take a seat and walk him through what was going on here. After the officer left, Debbie sat down and said she knew how strange it must sound that she had waited this long. But if Lambert knew her sister Shannon, it would make way more sense. She said that Shannon had a history of just sort of taking off and not talking to anyone for long periods of time. It was something she'd done since she was a teenager. And as difficult as it was to deal with that, Shannon's friends and family had sort of come to accept it about her. It was one of the things that made Shannon who she was. But now they noticed that Shannon had not called on a couple of family birthdays, and she also hadn't checked in when her best friend had a baby, and that was not like Shannon at all. Even when she went away without telling anyone, she would always call on these important days. Detective Lambert didn't say this, but he knew 4 months might as well have been an eternity when it came to a missing persons case. If Shannon had really left town like her sister claimed she liked to do, well, Shannon could be anywhere in the world by now. But Lambert figured he would just start his investigation the same way he would if Shannon had only been missing for a few days. So he took down information about Shannon's physical appearance, her last known address, and the places she had worked. He also learned small details like Shannon's favorite color was pink, and she loved wearing friendship bracelets. And so after only speaking to Debbie for a few minutes, Detective Lambert had a pretty good picture of who Shannon was. But he had one more question. He asked Debbie if Shannon had a romantic partner. Debbie said yes, Shannon had a boyfriend, or at least she did the last time they had spoken. She had been living with a guy named Arturo Novoa, and Shannon had told Debbie that she and Arturo fought all the time. The following day, Detective Lambert sat down with Arturo in a small interview room at the station. Lambert had looked into Arturo the night before. He knew Arturo had a couple of minor run-ins with the police, but nothing big, and he had no record of violent crimes or anything like that. So Lambert really just hoped that Arturo knew where Shannon was, or at least had heard from her over the past 4 months, and also, if he hadn't, he hoped to get a good idea of what Arturo and Shannon's relationship had been like. But when Lambert asked Arturo when he'd last seen or talked to Shannon, Arturo seemed surprised by the question. He said he'd already told all this to Shannon's family when they'd called him like a month or so earlier. He said he and Shannon had broken up back in February. He admitted that things ended pretty badly, so they had not spoken to each other since. The last he'd heard, Shannon was living with some guy in Cleveland, which was over an hour away from Youngstown. Arturo didn't know the name of the man that Shannon was supposedly living with, so he really couldn't provide much more color than he already had. And so Lambert wrapped up their conversation soon after that, and then he reached out to Shannon's sister, Debbie, to see if she knew of any men, other than Arturo, that Shannon could possibly be with. Debbie said before Shannon had started dating Arturo, she'd been in a serious relationship with a man named John Scarata. Just hearing that name shocked Lambert, and it caused him to immediately begin planning his next move, because he knew John Scarata all too well. John had a substantial criminal history. In fact, he had done time in prison on drug charges, and Lambert knew that John had gotten out of prison right around the last time anyone had seen Shannon. After speaking to Debbie, Detective Lambert got to work right away tracking down John, and it would turn out he was not in Cleveland. He was in Youngstown, trying to get his life together after getting out of prison. The following day, when John Scarata walked into the interview room at the station, he greeted Detective Lambert like they were old friends. And when the detective brought up Shannon, John didn't seem surprised at all. He said he'd learned Shannon had disappeared not long after he'd gotten out of prison. So Lambert asked if he was worried about her. And John, in response to this, did something that Lambert did not see coming at all. John leaned forward in his chair and said yes, he was really worried. In fact, he was so worried, he'd started his own investigation. Lambert was so caught off guard by this that he didn't really know how to react. What did John mean he was doing his own investigation? But just then, John grabbed his phone out of his pocket, pulled up his photos, and showed them to Lambert. And Lambert saw multiple pictures of different cars that had been parked right outside of Shannon's apartment over the past few months. John had staked out the place, looking for Shannon or for anything or anyone that seemed out of the ordinary. Lambert felt a little conflicted. He believed if something bad had happened to Shannon, John had to be a major suspect here. But he couldn't deny that he did want to track down all of these cars John had photographed at Shannon's apartment. So, ultimately, Lambert did get the license plate numbers of all the cars, and he told John to stop staking out Shannon's place and to just let the police do their jobs. John said he totally understood. He just wanted to find Shannon and make sure she was okay. Detective Lambert knew John had connections to the criminal world of Youngstown, Ohio, so there really was a chance that John thought he was the best person to find Shannon, a woman he claimed to still be in love with. But there was also a chance that John was just trying to send the police on some kind of wild goose chase to keep them off of his trail, because maybe he had something to do with what happened to Shannon. So, in the days following their meeting, Lambert and his team tried to get a clear picture of everywhere John had been since he'd gotten out of prison, and if he'd had any communication with Shannon near the time she'd supposedly disappeared. Police also questioned Shannon's friends, her family, and her coworkers at the nightclub, and they also followed up on all those cars John had photographed. But for Shannon's half-sister Debbie, the police were not moving fast enough. She now believed that she and her family had waited way too long to get the cops involved, and so she felt like she had to do something to make up for that. So, in late June, about a week after she had filed the missing persons report, Debbie knocked on the door of a house in Youngstown that looked pretty much like all the other houses around it, except for the sign in the window that advertised psychic readings. A woman with a soft smile opened the door and led Debbie down a hallway to a small dark room. The woman told Debbie she was a psychic medium, which meant she claimed to be able to communicate with spirits or the deceased and then was able to relay their messages to the living. Debbie sat down at a table with the medium and described Shannon and talked about how she'd been missing for months. The medium closed her eyes and listened carefully, and after a moment, she told Debbie she could see something, a bridge. Now, this medium didn't know exactly which bridge this was, but she was sure it was not far away from here. And somehow, this bridge had to be connected to Shannon's disappearance. Debbie left the medium's house and immediately called a friend of hers and told her what the medium had said. And both women decided it was clear what they had to do next. They would have to search every bridge in Youngstown, Ohio. And so for the next couple of weeks, Debbie and her friend went around town visiting every bridge they could find. And it started to feel like a waste of time. That is, until one afternoon when Debbie and her friend approached a small bridge that neither of them had driven on before. As they stepped out of the car, they saw something laying on the ground near the base of one of the bridge's girders. When Debbie walked over to it and knelt down to get a better look, she almost started crying. Because there, laying on the ground, were saw blades, a rope, and a pink sock. Debbie and her friend took pictures of the objects and then drove straight to the police station. Debbie told Detective Lambert about the medium's vision and showed him the photos of what they'd found at the bridge. Lambert had learned from Debbie when they first met that Shannon's favorite color was pink, and that she loved wearing pink clothes. He couldn't just ignore saw blades and a rope being found out in the middle of nowhere next to a pink sock. So, the detective told Debbie that he and his team would look into it right away. But as Lambert headed out to this bridge, he started to feel like this case was getting away from him. He was already dealing with the missing woman's ex-boyfriend conducting his own investigation, and now he was following up on a lead that apparently came from a psychic medium. And Lambert still had no idea what had happened to Shannon. She really could just be in Cleveland or anywhere else, purposefully avoiding her friends and family. Or she could be the victim of a horrible crime. One way or the other, Lambert needed some piece of concrete evidence to point him in the right direction. And while he didn't want to rule anything out, he doubted that that piece of evidence was going to come from a psychic vision. About a month later, on the afternoon of July 29th, a woman was making Italian food at her house in a small town just a few miles from Youngstown. As she cooked, she looked down at the food she was making, and suddenly she got mad at herself. She realized she didn't have enough meat to make the meatballs she was planning to serve with this meal. She thought about taking a quick trip to the grocery store, but then she remembered something. So she called out to her husband in the next room and told him to keep an eye on the stove. She left the kitchen and walked down a set of old wooden steps into the basement. She passed by their washer and dryer, and walked over to a white, rectangle-shaped chest freezer that was standing up against the wall. Now, this woman knew there was meat inside this freezer, and she could use it to make her meatballs. But there was a problem. The freezer had a padlock on it. But the woman was undeterred. She grabbed a nearby screwdriver off a work table and used it to pry the entire metal latch that the lock was connected to off the freezer. And so now, with the freezer unlocked, the woman opened it up, and immediately she began to scream. At about 5:30 that afternoon, 2 hours after that woman had looked inside the freezer, crime scene investigator Tony Marzullo walked down the stairs into the married couple's basement. Marzullo worked out of Youngstown, but he helped in the surrounding smaller towns when he was needed. And today, he'd gotten one of the strangest calls he'd ever received from police dispatch in one of those smaller towns. Marzullo put on his gloves and approached the freezer. The freezer door was still open, and he could see inside of the freezer was an orange plastic bucket with trash bags sticking out of it. Marzullo got closer and leaned over the freezer and looked inside of that bucket. And the instant he did, he reflexively put his hand over his mouth and tried to collect himself. Even the call from dispatch had not prepared him for this. Because in the bucket, Marzullo was looking at the top half of a frozen, severed human head. Marzullo looked down deeper into the freezer, and he saw the entire thing was basically filled with trash bags. And as he pulled out each of these bags and looked inside of them, he found human legs, human arms, and human hands. Marzullo had no idea who the victim was, but instinctively, he grabbed his phone and called Detective Lambert. Later that evening, Detective Lambert stood in the basement with Marzullo and a group of police officers and forensic technicians. Like Lambert had expected, the psychic vision and the objects found at that bridge had not given him any new leads in Shannon's case, and neither had any of the interviews Lambert had conducted to this point. Basically, the case had stalled. He had no idea where Shannon was or what happened to her. But now, as he stood over the freezer, he had a sinking feeling that the body he was looking at could be hers. Now, they would need to run some tests to officially identify the body, but Marzullo was very confident they could do that quickly. Forensic techs would allow the severed hands they'd found to defrost. Then they would use a saline solution to rehydrate the fingers on those hands, which would allow them to pull clean fingerprints. While Lambert waited for those results, he interviewed the married couple who lived at the house to try to figure out how a dismembered body had wound up in their basement. The couple proved to be extremely cooperative. They said that freezer was not theirs. A friend had asked to store it in their house because the electricity in his house had been cut off, and he didn't want the meat in the freezer to go bad. When their friend had brought it over, they did think it was odd that the freezer had a padlock on it, but they'd assumed the freezer door just didn't stay shut on its own, so their friend must have locked it just to make sure the meat inside stayed frozen. The woman went on to tell Lambert that the only reason she had broken into the freezer is because she really wanted to make meatballs. Lambert thought the story was definitely strange, but none of it sounded untrue. So he asked who was this friend who gave them the freezer. They said his name was Anthony Gonzalez, but he was trying to become a hip-hop star, so sometimes he went by the name Tony G. That night, Lambert began his search for Anthony Gonzalez, aka Tony G. But despite it seeming like a pretty common name, he could not find a single Anthony Gonzalez living in Youngstown. And before Lambert could expand his search for Anthony to nearby towns, he got a call from Marzullo. Marzullo told him the lab had successfully pulled fingerprints from the now defrosted hands they'd found, and they were able to officially identify the victim. The body in the freezer was Shannon Graves. Now that police had finally found Shannon's body, and this had become a homicide investigation, news of the grisly discovery in the basement spread across Youngstown. And in the days following the discovery, Detective Lambert got an unexpected visitor at the station. Shannon's ex-boyfriend, John, had returned. John had heard about Shannon's body, and he admitted right off the bat to Detective Lambert that, despite what he'd promised him, he said he had not actually given up his own investigation into Shannon's case. And in fact, now, he had discovered something huge. John heard from a friend of his about a house party that had taken place a few months earlier. And at this house party, a man named Andrew Herman had been burning some of Shannon's stuff in a huge bonfire. With help from John, Detective Lambert and several other investigators found their way to the house where this party had taken place. And as soon as they got out of their cars, they could see the remnants of a bonfire in the front yard. There was a big pit filled with ashes and big pieces of wood around it that looked like they'd been used for seating. Lambert and a crime scene investigator walked across the dying grass in the front yard. They put on their gloves and began sifting through the large pile of ashes, and they found what looked like charred clothing and some burned pieces of plastic. But to their utter shock, it looked like one object had survived the fire and remained almost perfectly preserved. And as Lambert bent down and pulled this object out of the ashes, he almost couldn't believe it. Because of all the possible things he could have found, this was like the perfect clue. The object was a friendship bracelet with small plastic beads strung on it that spelled out Shannon. There was no doubt that John had been right. Somebody had been burning Shannon's things. Investigators headed back to the station with this new piece of evidence, and Lambert set up a meeting with Andrew Herman, the man John said had been burning Shannon's things. But John warned Lambert to watch out, because Andrew was a total psychopath. A guy who was into black magic and who worshipped the serial killer cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer. On August 7th, 2017, so about a week and a half after the discovery of Shannon's body, Detective Lambert led Andrew into an interview room. And Lambert had to admit that Andrew was not anything like what he'd expected. Andrew wore a well-fitted suit and tie, and his hair was short and neatly combed. He looked way more like a guy who worked at a bank than somebody who was into black magic and serial killers. But Lambert knew the way this guy was dressing didn't prove anything, one way or another. Detective Lambert told Andrew right away that they had gone to the site of the house party and discovered a friendship bracelet inside of a fire pit that they were sure belonged to Shannon Graves, and that they'd heard Andrew was the one trying to burn it. Andrew nodded and said, yep, the bracelet was Shannon's, and he was trying to burn it. And he also admitted that he and a couple other people had also burned some of Shannon's other things at that party. Lambert just looked at him and said it seemed very suspicious that they had burned the belongings of a woman who'd recently been found brutally murdered. But Andrew did not flinch. In a perfectly calm voice, he said they had burned the stuff as a favor for a friend, Anthony Gonzalez. Now, Detective Lambert did not react to what he was hearing, but inside, after hearing that name, he felt like he was about to lock up this investigation. Because he was now able to connect Anthony, aka Tony G., the man who'd brought the freezer to the married couple's basement, directly to the bonfire that had been used to get rid of Shannon's personal belongings. So Lambert asked why his friend, Anthony, had wanted to burn Shannon's stuff in the first place. Andrew sat there in silence for a minute, and then he began to speak. And when he did, without ever losing his cool, he told a story that was even gorier and more disturbing than any story Detective Lambert had ever heard in his life. And by the time Andrew stopped telling this story, Lambert knew exactly what had happened to Shannon Graves. Based on information from Andrew, evidence found in the basement freezer, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Shannon on February 24, 2017, and the following days. The killer walked through Shannon's apartment, breathing heavily and clutching a hammer in their hand. They could hear the shower running, so they headed for the bathroom. Once there, they opened the door and stepped inside. Shannon shouted something and pulled back the shower curtain, but before she could even figure out what was happening, the killer raised the hammer and slammed it into the top of her head. Shannon's body collapsed in the shower, and blood began to run into the drain. As for the killer, they continued to swing the hammer over and over again into Shannon's head. Her body twitched and then eventually stopped moving. She was dead in the shower. The killer turned off the water and just stood there for a second, staring down at what they'd done. And for the first time, they realized that killing Shannon was actually just the beginning. Now they had to get rid of her body. The killer rushed to the kitchen, found trash bags, and came right back. They opened up a bathroom cabinet, grabbed an electric razor, and turned it on. Then they leaned into the shower and shaved Shannon's head, believing this would help disguise her identity. When they were finished, the killer put the razor back, opened one of the trash bags, and awkwardly pulled Shannon's body out of the shower onto the bathroom floor. They tried to stuff Shannon into the trash bag, but quickly realized that was never going to work. So they tried to wrap the trash bag around her, but that failed too. the bag just wasn't big enough. The killer started to panic. They knew they had not thought this through. So they grabbed their phone and called their girlfriend. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. The killer opened it and quickly led their girlfriend into the bathroom and showed her Shannon's body. The girlfriend did her best to stay calm. She said after dark, they could move Shannon's body to her place and figure out what to do with it from there. So the killer and their girlfriend spent a couple of hours in Shannon's apartment just kind of waiting around with Shannon's dead body only a few feet away. Not long after sunset, the killer and the girlfriend grabbed Shannon's clothes off the bathroom floor, they took her purse, and then did their best to wrap Shannon's body up in trash bags. Then they carried her body and her belongings out into the darkness and put everything into the trunk of the girlfriend's car. They drove to the girlfriend's house and brought Shannon's body inside and laid it in the bathtub. Then the killer called the one friend they thought could help. And later that night, that friend arrived with a fully formed plan and a machete. The killer, the girlfriend, and the friend of the killer spent the entire night dismembering Shannon's body. At some point, the friend told the killer to order sulfuric acid online and to set up a delivery at a bulk store nearby. In the meantime, the friend gathered up all of Shannon's stuff the group had in their possession and went to a house party, where they knew there was going to be a big bonfire, and they burned everything. Not long after that, the sulfuric acid arrived at the bulk store. Killer picked it up, and the three of them covered the now dismembered body parts in the sulfuric acid, hoping to melt Shannon's skin down to the bone. But they soon discovered a problem. In an effort to save money, the killer had bought off-brand sulfuric acid, and it just was not doing the trick. Large parts of Shannon's body were disintegrating in the acid, but not all of it was. So the friend took the machete and started hacking away even more at Shannon's body, while the killer went out and bought a chest freezer. And eventually, the three of them were able to get Shannon's body parts into trash bags and a bucket, and they crammed all of that into the freezer and locked it. And at that point, the killer's friend, who made a point of studying serial killers, believed they had completely covered their tracks. Andrew Herman, the man who supposedly worshipped Jeffrey Dahmer, oversaw the disposal of Shannon's body and her belongings. And his friend, Anthony Gonzalez, who also went by his hip-hop name Tony G, murdered Shannon. But it would turn out Anthony Gonzalez and Tony G, those two names, were both aliases. Anthony, aka Tony G, was actually Shannon's boyfriend, Arturo Novoa. On the night that he and Shannon had fought and he stormed out, Arturo did not leave for good. Instead, he came back, grabbed a hammer, and killed Shannon. But Arturo had not thought the murder through. So after it was done, he called his other girlfriend, the woman who Shannon had seen him hanging around with at the nightclub, for help. This girlfriend, who knew Arturo by his alias, Anthony Gonzalez, was very devoted to him and was willing to do whatever it took to protect him, which is why she was willing to help dispose of Shannon's body. Police had considered Arturo a suspect, and when they interviewed him after the missing persons report was filed, Arturo worried they would start closing in. So he had taken the freezer with Shannon's body in it to the house of a married couple he knew. He told them he had no electricity at his place and asked them to store the freezer so the meat wouldn't go bad. And they agreed. After the discovery of Shannon's body in their basement, police had begun to look for Anthony Gonzalez, which the married couple believed was their friend's real name who owned the freezer. But it was when the couple showed the police a picture of Anthony that the police knew they were onto something, because they could tell the photo was not of Anthony. The photo was of Arturo. And finally, Shannon's ex-boyfriend, John, who had his own investigation, helped Detective Lambert solidify his case. When John led Lambert to the remnants of the bonfire and Shannon's friendship bracelet, it allowed Lambert to bring in Andrew for questioning, because that's who John said was burning all the stuff. And Andrew, when he was interviewed, just told Detective Lambert all about the horrors that had taken place from the moment Arturo killed Shannon until the moment the freezer ended up in the married couple's basement. Arturo was ultimately sentenced to 48 years to life in prison. His girlfriend was sentenced to 18 years for her role in the crime, and Andrew was sentenced to 12 years. On the evening of October 28, 2012, 87-year-old Barbara Howe sat at the dinner table with a friend in her house at the Mount Pleasant Retirement Village in the small town of Monroe, Ohio. As the two women began eating, Barbara's friend had a huge smile on her face. She couldn't get over how Barbara still loved to cook and how good she was at it. At 87 years old, Barbara made it a point to stay active, and she loved cooking and having people over to her house as often as she could. And when she wasn't entertaining, she loved to drive her prized red Cadillac around town and visit the shops on Main Street. At the dinner table, Barbara broke down the latest episode of Dancing with the Stars, which she watched religiously, and then also the two women caught each other up on what was going on with their kids and their grandkids. Barbara's husband had died about 14 years earlier, and since then she lived on her own. But her family, especially her daughters and her granddaughter Barbie, made sure she was never by herself too often. Just then, the landline phone rang, and Barbara shook her head. People calling during dinner time was so rude, as far as she was concerned. But she excused herself from the table and walked into the bedroom to grab it. The person on the phone said they were working in the retirement village that evening to fix and update all of the residents' Lifeline medical alert systems. Lifeline was a device that allowed someone to push a single button in order to get medical help in case of an emergency. Everyone who lived at Mount Pleasant had one, and it had a piece of equipment connected to the phone line that sometimes required maintenance. Barbara thanked the Lifeline worker for letting her know, said she'd see them soon, hung up, and went back to the table. Barbara and her friend talked and ate a while longer, and then finished up their dinner. They made plans to catch up again the following week, said goodnight, and then Barbara's friend headed out. Barbara cleared the table and started cleaning up the kitchen right away. She'd been a neat freak her entire life, and she couldn't stand having any kind of mess or clutter in her house. When she was finished cleaning, she poured herself a glass of iced tea, walked into the living room, and sat down in her favorite chair. She put her drink down on a small table right by her chair, then she grabbed the remote and turned on the TV. But just as she began flipping through the channels, she heard a knock at her front door. 2 days later, on the morning of October 30th, Detective Greg Myers of the Monroe Police Department took a call at his desk. The woman on the phone quickly introduced herself as Donna Wesselman, and Detective Myers thought she sounded very frantic. Donna said she had plans to meet up with her mother, Barbara Howe, later that day, but she'd been trying all morning and she couldn't get a hold of her. And this was not normal. Her mom always answered her cell phone, or at least called back within a few minutes. Donna said she talked to family and her mother's closest friends, and nobody had heard from Barbara in over a day. And her mom was 87 years old, so she was really worried that she might have fallen down in the house, gotten hurt, and now couldn't call for help. Detective Myers got Barbara's address and told Donna to meet him there. He would do a wellness check on her mother and make sure everything was okay. After Myers hung up, he headed right out to his car. As a veteran detective in a small police department, he was used to handling all kinds of cases. The Monroe PD didn't have things like missing persons or homicide divisions, so the few detectives on the force had to jump in wherever they were needed, including wellness checks like this one. As Myers drove past the town's quiet Main Street, he looked at all the old-fashioned shops that were all decorated for Halloween, and he thought it looked like something out of a classic 1950s horror movie. A few minutes later, Myers arrived at the Mount Pleasant Retirement Village, and he found Donna very anxiously waiting outside of her mother's house for him. After reassuring Donna that everything was okay, he'd go in there with her, Donna pulled out the key that she had to her mother's house, she walked up to the front door, and she opened it. The pair walked into Barbara's house, and immediately Donna called out to her mother, but there was no response. Now, at first glance, nothing looked out of place to Detective Myers. He didn't see any signs of forced entry or struggle, which made total sense, because he believed Barbara had most likely fallen or gotten hurt while she was alone at the house. Detective Myers and Donna quickly searched every room in the house, but there was no sign of Barbara anywhere. But when they came back into the TV room, Donna noticed a glass on a small table, and she pointed at it, and she had this frightened look on her face. Myers didn't understand. It was just a half-empty glass of what looked like iced tea. But Donna said her mother had to be one of the neatest people alive. She would never leave a half-empty glass on the table like that. Detective Myers glanced around the room. Other than the iced tea, he didn't see any other indications that Barbara had been home recently. So he asked Donna if her mother still drove, and she said yes, she did, all the time. Myers led Donna back outside, and as soon as she was out there, she suddenly realized something else was off. Her mother's prized red Cadillac was gone. Detective Myers quickly shifted his focus from the house to the missing car. He now worried that Barbara might have driven off the road, or maybe gotten into some kind of car accident. She could have been injured and trapped in the car somewhere for almost 2 days now. He told Donna to go home and wait for his call. In the meantime, he'd issue a BOLO, a be on the lookout call, for Barbara's red Cadillac. This would go to law enforcement departments all over the area. Myers got in his car and immediately called in the BOLO. He also reached out to the Ohio State Police, because he knew his department just did not have the resources to carry out a full-scale search for Barbara. And since she'd possibly been missing now for almost 48 hours, he needed all the help he could get, and he needed it fast. 2 days later, on November 1st, Detective Myers sat at his desk, desperately hoping for some kind of lead on Barbara or her missing car. He'd stayed in regular contact with local, county, and state law enforcement agencies, all of whom were aiding in the search, but so far, nobody had found anything. He had also continued to update Barbara's daughter, Donna, about the whole situation, and he'd begun receiving regular phone calls from Barbara's granddaughter, Barbie, who was a young adult. In fact, Barbie had become kind of relentless, asking for regular updates and wanting specific details of the police search. Myers knew Barbara's family was upset and panicked, of course, and they had every right to want answers from the police. But right from the get-go, something about these calls from Barbie just seemed off to him. Still, at this point, he believed Barbara most likely had gotten into a car accident, so he didn't think too much about why her granddaughter was behaving strangely. After all, stress can make people act in all kinds of different ways. At around 1 p.m. that day, Myers' phone rang, and he finally got the news he'd been waiting for. A state police helicopter had conducted an overhead search, and they had located Barbara's red Cadillac. It was in the parking lot of an apartment complex in the town next to Monroe. Detective Myers contacted the local police from that town, and then rushed out to his car and drove over to that apartment complex. When Myers arrived, he saw local police officers already on site, waiting for him. And he also saw a man wearing a dark suit getting out of what was clearly an unmarked police car. Myers stepped outside, and the man in the suit came over to him. The man introduced himself as Agent Brian White of the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and he said he was there to help. Detective Myers had been holding out hope that even if Barbara was hurt, he would still find her safe and relatively unharmed. But as he and Agent White walked towards the red car, they feared that that was not the situation. Because as soon as they got near the car, they could smell something. It was the smell of bleach. And Myers knew that, almost always, bleach was an indication that somebody had tried to cover up a crime. And as they got closer to the car, they saw the trunk was not completely closed, and clearly the bleach smell was coming out of there. And then, once the two officers were standing right behind the trunk, sort of wincing from the bleach smell, they looked down and saw very clearly there were long strands of human hair sticking out of the trunk. At this point, Myers and White put on their gloves and opened up the trunk. And what they found inside was somehow even more horrifying than what they had expected. They had already expected the worst. There was a deceased woman laying in the trunk, and they immediately identified her as Barbara Howe. Barbara was almost completely naked, chunks of her hair had been cut off, and there was a strange gray dust covering her body. And her head barely remained attached to her neck. Police immediately began searching the Cadillac and the surrounding area. But the state forensics team needed more space, and they wanted to get the car and Barbara's body into a more controlled environment. None of these small-town police departments in the area had facilities to house a car for a full forensic search. So the local fire department cleared out space at their station and let the police move the car there. Once the forensics team had the time and space to really get to work, They told Myers and White that the killer had most likely poured bleach all over Barbara's body after she was dead. But the killer had not bleached the trunk or the car. And forensics techs said that after the killer covered Barbara's body in bleach, they had most likely emptied out a vacuum cleaner on her. That's where the techs thought that strange gray dust covering her body had come from. But most importantly, they said they had found some blood in the trunk and the car, but not nearly enough to match the brutal, deep wounds on Barbara's neck. They said if that kind of attack had been delivered in the trunk or the car, they would have found far more blood than they did. So, based on this, Detective Myers and Agent White believed the murder must have taken place somewhere else, and Barbara had been dumped in her own trunk and then driven to the apartment complex. The investigators thought that the most likely site of the murder would have to have been Barbara's house, but Myers had been there for that wellness check, and he hadn't seen any blood or anything that indicated a violent attack had taken place there. That said, Myers knew he could have overlooked something while he was there. There hadn't been a reported homicide in Monroe, Ohio in almost a decade. So when Myers had gone to Barbara's house, the thought that Barbara, an 87-year-old woman who lived in an upscale retirement village, had been brutally murdered there had not really even crossed his mind, so he wasn't really looking for indications of a murder. So Myers and Agent White gathered up a group of Monroe police officers and Ohio State troopers and went back to Barbara's house to conduct a much more thorough, full-scale search. Later that evening, now almost 4 full days after anyone had seen Barbara alive, Myers, White, and their team walked through Barbara's house, and nothing new really stood out. There still didn't appear to be any signs of forced entry or of a struggle of any kind. Detective Myers also found jewelry boxes that were filled with what looked like really expensive rings and necklaces just laying out in the open in Barbara's bedroom. And it didn't look like anyone had touched Barbara's high-end TV or any of the other electronics in the house. So it definitely did not appear like someone had come to burglarize the house. And even though Barbara's daughter had talked about how clean her mom was, a glass of iced tea on a table was not enough to prove that something bad had happened there. So Myers and White started to think that they would have to expand their search across Monroe and the nearby towns in order to find the location where Barbara had been killed. But as they were getting ready to pack up and leave Barbara's house, they both noticed something at the exact same time. The heater came on in the house, and they could feel the heat coming from the floor. This meant that there were pipes under the floor that were heating the house. And they knew there had to be a way for maintenance workers to get to those pipes if they needed repairs. So Agent White called out to the team on site and said they needed to search the house for any place that might provide access to the pipes under the floor. And within a couple of minutes, a state trooper shouted for White and Myers, and they rushed through the house, and they found him inside of a utility room just off the kitchen. The trooper pointed to the floor, and Myers and White looked at each other and then bent down, because they saw a wooden panel that almost completely blended in with the floor, and they realized this was actually the entrance to a crawl space. They lifted up the wooden panel and they looked inside. And right away, both men felt a mix of excitement and horror. There, in this tiny crawl space, they saw a rug that was covered in blood, and there was blood spatter all over the floor and the sides of this crawl space. Late that night, after forensics techs had collected blood and possible DNA samples from the rug, the crawl space, and throughout the house, Myers and White laid out a plan. They knew that a group of trained law enforcement officers, including both of them, had searched this house and almost left without finding the entrance to that crawl space. So they didn't believe that Barbara's killer was just some random person who just happened to stumble upon that hidden panel in the utility room floor. Instead, they were sure that her killer must have had intimate knowledge of the layout of the house. And for Myers and White, only a limited number of people could fit the bill. Staff members and maintenance crew who worked at the retirement village, and Barbara's close friends and family. Agent White had the resources at his disposal to track down and interview everyone on staff at Mount Pleasant. So Myers, who was well respected in the local community, would handle speaking to Barbara's friends and family. And Detective Myers knew who he wanted to start with, because he lived by a simple adage when it came to police work. If there's a fire, and someone watching that fire burn wants to know all the details about how it started and how it spread, there's a good chance that person may have started the fire. and Myers thought the same went for violent crimes. And there was one person who had wanted all the details about Barbara's disappearance and the police investigation from the very beginning: her own granddaughter, Barbie. In the days following the discovery of that crawl space, Detective Myers and his team dug deeper into Barbara's life and her relationship with her granddaughter. And what they found did not really surprise them. Barbara was loved by pretty much everyone who knew her. She was smart, funny, and always looked out for other people. But hearing things like this was pretty common for police when talking to people who had just lost their loved one. But Myers got the sense that Barbara really was this kind person who had tried to take care of other people for most of her life. However, there was something else that Myers kept hearing about Barbara. She and her late husband had apparently always been great with money. So, over the years, Barbara had become extremely wealthy. And because of the type of person she was, she wanted to take care of everyone she loved after she was gone. Which meant her kids stood to inherit sizable portions of her wealth once she passed away. And also, so did her granddaughter, Barbie. And so, armed with this information, Detective Myers brought Barbie in for an interview at the police station. Barbie sat down across from Myers at his desk, and she proved to be as talkative as she'd been every time she'd called him about the investigation. Over the course of this conversation, Barbie communicated to Myers that she loved her grandmother. But she also communicated that she was having some money issues. She told him that she really had to work hard just to pay her rent and cover her bills. Now, on the surface, that did not seem particularly strange to Myers. Barbie came off like a lot of young people do who were living on their own for the first time. But there was also something that Myers could not quite figure out. Barbie still seemed like she wanted to know everything about the investigation, and Myers honestly couldn't tell if this was because of some morbid curiosity, if it was nerves, grief, or if she really was the arsonist watching the fire she had set. So, eventually, he told Barbie that the best way she could help the investigation would be to provide a DNA sample. And Barbie said yes, of course. And so Myers had an officer swab her cheek to get the sample, and then after that, he let her go. Part of Myers didn't want to believe that someone could do something so horrific to their own grandmother. After all, Barbara hadn't just been killed, she'd been brutalized. But regardless of what he wanted to believe, and even though Barbie had cooperated, Myers still had to consider her a major suspect at this point. She had tried to inject herself into the police investigation, she had a clear financial motive, and she was young and physically capable enough to have easily overpowered her grandmother. While Detective Myers continued to focus on Barbara's friends and family, Agent White and state police methodically interviewed staff members and the maintenance crew from the Mount Pleasant retirement village. And they also tried to collect voluntary DNA samples from as many employees as they could. But the investigation took time. There were so many people to interview just at Mount Pleasant alone that it became clear this case would not be solved overnight. And as the weeks passed by and still they had not caught the killer, Myers and White started to realize their investigation was causing a full-on panic in the retirement community. Homicide cases were almost unheard of in Monroe, so Barbara's murder had already shocked everyone in town. But now the people who lived at Mount Pleasant started to believe there was a killer on the loose who was specifically targeting senior citizens. And they feared that the police weren't any closer to finding this killer than they had been on day one of the investigation. As the Mount Pleasant residents made their feelings public, the pressure on the police and the company that oversaw operations at Mount Pleasant continued to mount. In order to demonstrate that they were doing everything they could to protect their residents, the company that ran the retirement village helped set up a tip line with the Monroe police, and even offered a $10,000 reward to anyone who provided information that led to an arrest. On December 7, 2012, so almost a month and a half after Barbara's murder, an officer ran into Myers' office with an excited look on his face. The officer told him there was someone on the tip line, and this guy had a bizarre story that Myers needed to hear right now. And so Myers picked up the tip line, and he heard the sound of a man who had a strong Kentucky accent. The man told Myers that he had no idea if his story would actually help the police, but something had happened over a month ago that he just couldn't shake. The man said that he lived in a small Kentucky town about 150 miles away from Monroe. and not long after Barbara Howe's murder, his brother, a man named Danny French, had come to see him. And Danny had acted really strange, almost like he was saying goodbye for the last time. Now, this conversation with his brother had been disturbing enough on its own, but it was not why this man had called the tip line. The reason he had called the tip line was there was something else about his brother that was off when he had come to say this goodbye. The man said his brother had been wearing a Mount Pleasant Retirement Village sweatshirt. Detective Myers asked the man where his brother was, because he wanted to speak to Danny right away. But the man said this is actually where things got even weirder, because soon after their conversation, his brother Danny had disappeared. Immediately following this call, Myers met with Agent White, and they reached out to local police in the Kentucky town where the caller lived. But after weeks of searching, the police couldn't find the man's missing brother, Danny French. But then, on January 18th, 2013, so 2.5 months after the murder, Detective Myers got a call from the cops in Kentucky. They said they had found Danny French, and apparently he'd been living in the woods for months. Myers got in his car and sped across the state line into Kentucky to the local police station where the cops had brought Danny. Danny was big and very intimidating looking. He had long gray hair and a huge gray beard, and he certainly looked and smelled like he'd been living outdoors for months. But it wasn't really Danny's appearance that shook Myers the most. Instead, it would be what Danny talked about. When Myers asked him about Barbara Howe, Danny said he didn't know her and had nothing to do with the murder. But when Myers asked him why he'd gone to live in the woods, Danny got this glazed look in his eyes, and he started talking about how the woods were a fantasy world and a place where people transformed into different things. Myers and Danny continued talking, and basically the conversation went in all sorts of different directions, into bizarre things that at times Myers just did not understand at all. It sort of seemed like Danny was sort of unhinged. But by the end of their discussion, despite the bizarreness of what they were talking about, it was clear Danny had to know something about what happened to Barbara. Myers just knew it. So when Myers left the station, he got assurances from the local police that they would keep close tabs on Danny. Still, as strange as all this might be, there was nothing actually tying Danny directly to Barbara's murder. So Myers returned to Ohio with another potential suspect, but no evidence. This had also been the case with Barbara's granddaughter Barbie and several of the Mount Pleasant employees who Agent White had interviewed. All good suspects, but no evidence. Investigators also received DNA test results of samples taken from multiple suspects and attempted to try to match them to samples found at the crime scene. Now, these results did eliminate some suspects, but they did not conclusively point to a killer. And soon, with no new evidence coming in, the investigation started to grind to a halt. Months passed, then a year went by with very few new leads. Myers and White still believed they had a few strong suspects here, but the evidence just wasn't strong enough to make any arrests. And so Barbara's case basically went cold. Fast forward to October of 2014, 2 years after Barbara's murder. Detective Myers sat in his office at the Monroe Police Station working on a different case. Now, he'd not given up on finding Barbara's killer, and both he and Agent White had continued to follow any potential leads. But Myers still worked for a small department, and so other cases did need his attention. Just then, Myers heard someone yelling his name, and then he looked up to see an officer rushing into the office with a grin on his face, and he handed Myers a piece of paper. Myers looked at the paper and saw a bunch of dates, times, and some handwritten notes, and then he asked the officer, what is this? Why are you so excited about this? And the officer said a lead in the Barbara Howe case that Myers had asked him to pursue had paid off. And this sheet of paper was a copy of the schedule that Barbara's cleaning woman had kept. Myers looked down at the schedule, and now that he knew what it was, his eyes suddenly went wide. He told the officer to find this cleaning woman and bring her in right away. He would have to ask her some questions, but Myers was now positive that this schedule finally made it clear who killed Barbara. Based on information from Barbara's cleaning woman, DNA test results, and evidence collected over the course of the entire investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Barbara on the night of October 28, and the early morning of October 29, 2012. The killer sat inside of their parked car, staring out at the homes that lined the quiet streets of the Mount Pleasant retirement village. The killer glanced at the clock. They knew Barbara was expecting them any minute, so it was time to move. They grabbed a stun gun sitting on the passenger seat and then stepped outside. The killer held the stun gun behind their back as they approached Barbara's house and then knocked on the door. Barbara opened the door, and the killer smiled and followed her inside. Barbara walked through the house towards her bedroom, and the killer stayed right behind her. And at some point, they raised the stun gun, pressed it to her back, and pulled the trigger. Barbara immediately felt an electric shock. She screamed, she convulsed, and fell to the floor. But to the killer's complete surprise, Barbara remained conscious, and she was trying to get back onto her feet. So the killer leapt on top of Barbara and hit her in the head, and then strangled her. Eventually, Barbara passed out. The killer stood up and picked up Barbara off the floor. She didn't weigh very much. The killer then carried her through the house into the utility room near the kitchen. They laid her on the floor, reached down, and pulled up the wood panel that hid the crawl space. Once it was open, the killer picked up Barbara and dropped her into the crawl space. And then they just stood there for a minute, thinking. After a little while, the killer simply walked out of the house, leaving the door unlocked behind them. They got in their car, drove off, and parked on a nearby street, where they could still see the Mount Pleasant retirement village. And the killer just sat there in their car and waited. Hours later, after midnight, the killer saw that almost all the lights in the retirement village had now gone off. It seemed like most residents were now asleep. So, the killer grabbed a long, sharp knife they had left on their floorboard, stepped out of their car, and quickly walked back to Barbara's house. The killer walked inside and went right to the crawl space. They looked in, and Barbara still lay there. She was unconscious, but breathing. The killer got on the floor, leaned down into the crawl space, grabbed Barbara by the hair, and slit her throat. Blood splashed onto the walls of the crawl space, but the killer didn't stop. They kept slicing and cutting Barbara's neck until they had almost decapitated her. Finally, the killer relented and stood up. They grabbed a small rug from the kitchen and slid it into the utility room. They reached down, lifted Barbara out of the crawl space, and dropped her lifeless body onto the rug. But as they did that, they realized that drool from their mouths had dripped and fallen into Barbara's hair. So they took the bloody knife and cut off that chunk of her hair. Then, for the next several minutes, the killer remained in the utility room with the body, living out their wildest and most grotesque fantasies. But at some point the killer panicked, as if they had just realized they might be leaving traces of their own DNA on Barbara's body. So they ran to the cabinet under the kitchen sink and grabbed a bottle of bleach. Then they ran back to the rug, took off Barbara's clothes, and poured the bleach all over her. Then they grabbed a vacuum cleaner that was in the utility room, opened up the bin, and dumped the dust onto Barbara's body. Finally, the killer grabbed Barbara's keys from the kitchen counter, rolled her up in the rug, and then carried her outside. In the darkness, the killer used the keys to pop open the trunk of Barbara's Cadillac. They dumped her body inside the trunk, but kept the rug. They slammed the trunk door, not noticing part of Barbara's hair was sticking out and that the trunk did not close all the way. The killer ran back into the house, threw the bloody rug into the crawl space, and covered the space up with the wood panel. Then they ran back outside, locking the door behind them, got into Barbara's car, and drove to an apartment complex in a nearby town. Once there, they abandoned the car and walked down a dark street to a large store that was open all night. From there, they called a cab, got a ride back to a spot that was not far from where they had left their own car. They walked back to their car, got in, and then sped across the state line into Kentucky. Danny French, the huge guy with the big gray beard who lived in the woods at one point and had that totally bizarre conversation with Detective Myers, murdered Barbara Howe. It would turn out Danny had once been a maintenance worker at the Mount Pleasant retirement village, so he knew all about that crawl space. He also knew that every resident had one of those lifeline medical emergency devices. So, on the night of the murder, he called 3 women at Mount Pleasant, posing as someone who was there to fix their lifeline devices. And Barbara was the only one who said he could come by that night to fix it. And as soon as Barbara opened up her door and let Danny into her home, he carried out his plan. From the moment Detective Myers met Danny after he'd been pulled out of the woods for his interview, he had suspected Danny was the killer. Danny told Myers the woods were his fantasy world. But the more he spoke, the more it became clear to Myers that, in reality, Danny just had a lot of fantasies, and some of them were very dark and violent. After multiple meetings over several months, Myers convinced Danny to provide a DNA sample, and it would turn out Danny's DNA matched samples found inside of Barbara's house. But there was a problem. Danny had been a maintenance worker, so he'd been in that house many times, which could explain why his DNA was there. It was not until police got in touch with Barbara's cleaning woman that they realized there was no way Danny's DNA should still be in her house, because Barbara's cleaning woman kept a detailed schedule. It had dates and times, and she liked to list all of the work she had done on those dates and times. And so police knew that Barbara's house had been cleaned thoroughly many times since Danny had stopped working at Mount Pleasant, which meant if his DNA was there now, he must have murdered Barbara. In addition to that, police found security camera footage at that store where Danny had called the cab on the night of the murder, and the cab driver was able to identify him. Danny was arrested, and he would eventually confess. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. On the evening of November 27, 2009, Michael Miller, or Big Mike as pretty much everyone knew him, was stomping around his property in Webster Plantation, Maine, studying his double-wide trailer and thinking through the new addition he was planning. Like his nickname suggested, 47-year-old Big Mike was a huge man, and he had a big bushy beard, and he looked right at home in this desolate rural setting. The trailer stood at the center of a snowy clearing along the edge of dark woods. There were no other buildings in sight, since Big Mike's closest neighbor lived almost 20 miles away. His hometown of Webster Plantation wasn't really a town at all. It had a population of 85 people, a one-room town hall, 2 roads, and no streetlights. There had never really been much to do there, aside from, creek fishing and taking in the nature, and for a lot of people, working at the local lumber mill. Big Mike had been a seasonal employee there for 29 years. But just 1 week ago, he'd been laid off. The loss of his job had stung, but he wasn't too worried. He and his wife Val lived frugally, and so they had enough cash stowed away to get by until he found another job. Big Mike was just about to head back inside when he heard a vehicle approaching. He turned to see a pair of headlights sweep through the trees. Then a familiar white Ford Explorer came into view and pulled up to his mobile home. It was his 2 sons, 27-year-old Mike Jr. and 26-year-old Matt. Mike Jr., the oldest son, was like a smaller, clean-shaven version of Big Mike. But Matt was a lot different. He was skinny and pale, with a buzz cut and tattoos along his neck. Matt also had heavy shadows under his eyes, like he hadn't been sleeping well. Big Mike had not expected to see his kids tonight, but was happy for the visit. So he walked up and gave them each a big hug and invited them inside. Then he called out to Val that the boys had stopped by for a visit, and within seconds, his wife appeared from the kitchen with a tin of her famous coffee cakes in hand. At 47 years old, Val was a very energetic and petite woman who looked even smaller standing next to her hulking husband. The family snacked and caught up, and then Val reminded everyone that they had a birthday tomorrow. Matt's baby daughter was turning 1. However, Matt still had not told anyone what the party plans were. Matt said they weren't really planning on doing anything, which Val immediately insisted was ridiculous. She said if Matt didn't want to plan something, well, she and Big Mike would be more than happy to host the party at their place. Matt tried to dissuade her, but finally just caved and agreed to let her host the party as long as it was small. Just immediate family, along with Mike Jr., Matt's girlfriend, as well as Mike Jr.'s best friend, Nate. The 3 of them were practically family anyway. Then Matt excused himself and asked if Big Mike could step outside for a moment. Big Mike's jaw instantly tensed. He could guess where this was heading. And sure enough, the moment they were outside together, Matt asked his father if he could borrow some money. Matt began talking about how he hadn't worked in months and was struggling with all the costs of a new baby. He couldn't even afford gifts or a cake for tomorrow. That's why they hadn't planned a party. When he finally finished his spiel, Big Mike told Matt not to worry about the cake. He and Val would be happy to pick one up before the party. But he couldn't lend Matt money at the moment. For one thing, Big Mike told his younger son that he'd himself just been laid off from his job at the mill, so money was tight for him. And more importantly, he couldn't trust that Matt would actually use the money for his family. Matt looked absolutely furious at his father's response, but he did not push the issue. He just shook his head and headed back into the mobile home, where he asked if Mike Jr. was ready to go. The boys left a few minutes later, giving Val a kiss on the cheek before climbing into Matt's Ford Explorer. Big Mike watched the SUV disappear into the forest, wondering if he had been too hard on Matt. Then he heard Val calling, and he turned to head back inside. Around 12:40 p.m. the next day, so Saturday, November 28th, another car pulled up outside of Big Mike and Val's mobile home. The driver climbed out, grabbed a red plastic gas can from the back seat, and started trudging through the snow toward the trailer. The driver's name was Alan Richardson, and he was a neighbor and friend of Big Mike and Val's. Alan had borrowed the gas can from Big Mike a few days earlier, and he was here now to return it. However, when he reached the trailer and knocked on the door, no one responded. Alan tried the door handle and found it was locked. Now, normally, Alan would have assumed that the Millers had just left to run an errand, but he looked and saw both of their vehicles were parked nearby. So he tried knocking again, and when he got no response again, he moved to the nearest window and peered inside. Tilting his head, he was able to make out what appeared to be homemade birthday decorations taped to one wall. There were also paper plates and a few liters of soda sitting out on the counter. It looked like Big Mike and Val were getting ready for a party. But just then, he noticed something disturbing on the kitchen floor. It took him a moment to realize what he was even looking at, but once he did, he nearly fell over backward. Because Big Mike and Val were both sprawled on the floor beside each other, not moving. Once Alan got over the initial shock, he rapped on the glass and called out to them, but they didn't move at all. Alan's hands shook as he pulled out his phone and punched in 911. The moment the dispatcher picked up, Alan told them he'd just discovered the Millers unconscious in their trailer with the door locked. He asked if he should break in and try to help them, but the dispatcher told him that could be dangerous. Whatever caused the Millers to collapse could still be in there, whether it was an electrical problem or a carbon monoxide leak or something else. And so the dispatcher instructed Alan to simply wait until the authorities arrived, which unfortunately would take a while since the nearest police station was over 30 miles away. Alan was still waiting nervously outside the mobile home when he heard sirens approaching through the woods. An ambulance rounded a bend in the trees, followed by a police cruiser and a fire engine, and they all pulled up in front of Alan, lights flashing. A police officer wearing a respirator mask told Alan to stand aside, and everyone waited while the firefighters tested the air around the door for carbon monoxide. When they announced that the coast was clear, the police forced open the door and entered the mobile home, followed by a pair of EMTs. And what they found, there in the kitchen, was Big Mike lying flat on his back, staring up at the ceiling, with his legs folded awkwardly beneath him. His wife Val was slumped by his side, with her head resting on his chest. Their skin was waxy and pale, they weren't breathing, and there was a small amount of blood on the floor around them. The EMTs checked for a pulse to be certain, but it was obvious the Millers were dead. And as soon as the EMTs looked more closely, it became clear what killed the Millers, and it was not carbon monoxide. They noticed a small hole in Val's right temple, and a similar one at the base of Big Mike's skull. The Millers had been shot. Meanwhile, Alan continued to wait outside, watching the activity from a distance and calling everyone he knew to tell them about his awful discovery. At the same time, local police and medical personnel continued to arrive one by one until an entire fleet of law enforcement vehicles filled the clearing. Finally, about a half an hour after the EMTs first entered the mobile home, lead investigators Darryl Peary and Brian Strout of the Maine State Police arrived. The detectives stepped out of their car, quickly introduced themselves to Alan, and then said they had a few questions for him. They wanted to know how Alan knew the Millers and why he was visiting that morning. He told them about borrowing the gas can and said that Big Mike and Val were some of his favorite neighbors, as good-natured and helpful as you could find. He also mentioned that he'd been surprised to find the door locked when he arrived. People around here typically left their doors unlocked. The detectives collected Allen's contact information and then told him he could leave. After that, they headed inside. Detective Peary's first thought upon entering the mobile home was just how neat everything was. When he got the call for 2 potential deaths at a trailer in the woods, he'd sort of half expected the place to be a cluttered mess, possibly even a drug den or meth lab. Instead, he found a tidy living room full of family photos and birthday decorations. This was a well-cared-for home. A very crowded home at the moment, since police officers were still busy photographing everything in sight. The detectives slipped through the crowd and made their way to the kitchen, where they found the medical examiner crouching over the Millers. Detective Strout leaned down close to examine the bullet hole in Val's right temple. As he did, Peary commented that there wasn't a lot of blood in the kitchen for a pair of gunshot wounds, and the medical examiner agreed, explaining that the murder weapon had to be a small, underpowered handgun like a .22. The detectives perked up when they heard this, because they knew such a small gun like a .22 would most likely be used at very close range, and if Big Mike was shot up close from behind, it suggested one of 2 things. Either he had been held at gunpoint and executed, or he knew his killer and trusted them well enough to invite them into his kitchen and then turn his back on them. Just as they were figuring out which was more likely, a police officer hurried over and said they'd just found something the detectives would want to see. Strout and Peary followed this officer to a small room that was full of shelves. They were stocked floor to ceiling with used electronics, stacks of DVDs, tools, and a small arsenal of firearms. Strout and Peary began walking through the room, pulling out random bins to check on the contents. They couldn't imagine what all this merchandise was doing here. But before they could figure it out, there was a commotion outside. The detectives went back to the living room and looked out the window at a young man in his late 20s flailing his arms in frustration while a sheriff's deputy blocked him from entering the front door. The man kept repeating that he needed to see his mother and father, until finally the deputy just said, "I'm sorry, Mike, they're gone." At that point, the young man began to sob. Then he stumbled back to his truck, which was parked alongside all the other law enforcement vehicles. By the time the detectives reached the man, he was sitting in the driver's seat with the door open, repeatedly trying to call someone on his cell phone. Strout and Peary introduced themselves to the young man, who replied that he was Mike Jr., the Millers' oldest son. They asked him why he had come to his parents' place, and he explained that he just heard from a friend that there was some kind of an accident at his mom and dad's place. And so he had brushed over as fast as he could, but he'd never expected to learn that both of his parents were dead. Mike Jr. said he had spent the last few minutes desperately trying to call his younger brother, Matt. Mike wanted to be the one to break the news before Matt heard it from someone else, but unfortunately, Matt wasn't picking up. Now, Mike Jr. set his phone aside and turned to Strout and Peary. He had the look of a man who was in shock, but he said he wanted to help and then offered to tell them anything they wanted to know. The detectives asked him if there was any reason he could think of that somebody might want to hurt his parents. Mike Jr. said what most people say in this situation right after they lose a loved one. He said his parents were great people and everybody loved them. However, as he said this, a worried look came across his face, and he told the detectives that while his dad had worked at the mill, whenever times got tough, he would supplement his income with a lucrative side hustle, operating a pawn shop and loan shark business right out of his mobile home. He said his father also bought and sold prescription narcotics. The whole operation was unlicensed and totally illegal, but this far from civilization, most people didn't care. Big Mike had a long list of regular customers who would often stop by out of the blue. This information cast the murders in a whole new light for the detectives. Big Mike and Val weren't just some respected couple mysteriously gunned down in their family home. They were the owners of a shady illegal business that very likely could have turned their trailer into a revolving door of unsavory characters. And the detectives figured Big Mike must have had large amounts of cash on hand to run his loan business. Maybe a desperate individual who did business with Mike saw him as an easy target. Detective Strout was now itching to get back inside the mobile home and verify whether anything was missing. But first, he asked Mike Jr. when he last heard from his parents. Mike Jr. said he'd spoken to his mother around 10 a.m. that morning to firm up details for his niece's birthday party, which Big Mike and Val were supposed to host that afternoon at their mobile home. Mike also said it sounded like his parents weren't alone because when he spoke to her, he heard people talking in the background. And he actually recognized one of the voices as his cousin, a man who was named Clayton Giddon. The detectives made a note that Clayton Giddon could have been the last person to see the Millers alive. After they wrapped up with Mike Jr., Detective Strout called the state police headquarters to try to get background information on Clayton. At the same time, Peary went back inside the trailer. He wanted to get a second look at the storage room where Big Mike had been running his business. And when he got back there and looked around at the cluttered space, it was impossible to say for sure whether anything had been taken. That is, until Peary found an orderly stack of ledgers on a shelf. Flipping through these pages, it quickly became clear that Big Mike had kept meticulous records. Everything he'd bought or sold and every dime he lent was marked and dated. And from the information on these records, Peary could see that a safe where Mike stored jewelry and other high-value items was clearly missing. He also couldn't find one ledger book from the set, which looked like it was the one that was used to track Big Mike's loans. And so Peary was thinking more than ever that robbery had to be the motive for the murders when his partner, Detective Strout, came in to join him. Strout said he had just spoken to the office, who had given him an address for Clayton Giddon, Mike Jr.'s cousin. He was located in the nearby tiny town of Springfield. Strout told his partner that Clayton was apparently an avid hunter, which meant he very likely owned a lot of guns. Now, both detectives were even more eager to talk to him. Later that afternoon, when Strout and Peary knocked on Clayton's door, a young girl answered. She ran to get her father and returned moments later with a man in his mid-30s. Clayton was clearly shaken up, as though he'd already heard the news about his aunt and uncle's deaths. However, when the detectives told him that Big Mike and Val were murdered, Clayton seemed startled. And then he became even more distraught when he realized he was a potential suspect. But Detective Peary promised Clayton they were only there to talk. So Clayton took a few calming breaths, then he invited them into the living room. Clayton told the detectives that he'd driven out to have coffee with his aunt and uncle that morning, and he'd taken his 9-year-old daughter with him. When they arrived at their mobile home around 10 a.m., Big Mike and Val were at ease and looking forward to the birthday party later that day. There was no sign of any trouble, and the couple did not seem like they were in danger. Detective Strout listened patiently, while at the same time studying the man for any sign that he might be lying. But Clayton seemed genuinely shocked. And if his daughter really had been there that morning, Strout had a hard time believing that Clayton was the killer. After all, who could commit murder in front of their own child? But suddenly, Clayton said something that made both detectives lean forward in their seats. He told them that he and his daughter were not the only ones at the Miller's place that morning. When they arrived, Big Mike and Val were already chatting with a young man named Nate Nightingale. Clayton didn't know exactly why Nate was there or what he was doing, but he said he didn't find it that unusual. Nate was Mike Jr.'s best friend, and he hung around the Miller's place all the time. But Clayton said the detectives should still talk to him, because when Clayton left the trailer at 10:30 a.m., Nate was still there. Hearing this, Strout and Peary could both feel the case starting to pick up speed. The Millers had been dead for only a matter of hours, but already the detectives had a potential witness who might have been in the room when the murders happened. When the detectives met at the state police office the following day, November 29th, they found new information waiting for them. The autopsy results had come in, and they confirmed that Big Mike and Val were killed with a .22 caliber pistol. This cemented the detectives' suspicions that they'd both been shot at close range, likely right there in their kitchen. The office had also pulled Big Mike's phone records, showing that he'd called a friend at 10:40 a.m. The detectives would contact this friend, and they would confirm that, yep, Big Mike had called them, and during their conversation, nothing had seemed off. That left a narrow 2-hour window when Big Mike and Val could have been shot. Big Mike was very much alive at 10:40 a.m., but the couple was dead by 12:44 p.m. when Alan Richardson, the neighbor, had called 911. So Strout and Peary got to work tracking down Nate Nightingale, perhaps the last known person to see the victims alive. But they were also eager to speak with Matt Miller, the younger son of Big Mike and Val, who still was not answering his phone. And as they would find out, Nate Nightingale and Matt lived right near each other. So the detectives set out to pay them each a visit. Matt's apartment was closer to the station, so Strout and Peary headed there first. And from the moment Matt answered the door, the detectives could sense that something was just off. The 26-year-old had shadows under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. But it was actually Matt's behavior, not his appearance, that really got their attention. Matt was not acting like someone who just lost his parents. He didn't show signs of grief or even press the detectives for any details on the progress of the case. Instead, he seemed nervous and evasive, almost like he just wanted Strout and Peary to leave as soon as possible. And the detectives responded to this behavior by actually pressing him on his whereabouts the previous day. He told them he had just been driving around Lincoln with his girlfriend Tanya and their infant daughter, picking up last-minute items for the birthday party that afternoon. Matt's alibi was short on details, and the way Matt refused to meet their eyes as he spoke made the detectives even more suspicious. And also, Tanya was out running errands with the baby, so she couldn't even confirm Matt's story. Strout felt sure that Matt must be hiding something, so he tried asking about his relationship with Big Mike and Val. Was he on good terms with his parents? Matt brushed the question off, saying of course he was on fine terms with them. They were his parents. And then after that, no matter what the detectives asked, Matt gave similarly curt responses. It eventually became clear the detectives were not going to get much more from him today. So they got a cell phone number for Matt's girlfriend, Tanya, and told him they'd follow up soon. And then they left to go talk to the next person on their list, Nate Nightingale. After their interview with Matt, speaking to Nate was like a breath of fresh air. From the moment Nate answered the door, he was polite and eager to help. Nate was clearly upset and told the detectives that he'd been close to the Millers for years. He had been best friends with Mike Jr. since high school, and he considered the Millers' trailer like his second home. Detective Peary asked Nate what he had been doing at the Millers' trailer on the morning of their murders. Nate said that he dropped by to catch up and also to take out a small loan from Big Mike. They'd just wrapped up business when Big Mike's nephew, Clayton Giddon, had arrived with his daughter. Nate said that Clayton left at 10:30, and then Big Mike took a phone call shortly after that. And then after Mike got off the phone, Nate said his goodbyes. To this point, Nate's story about what happened that morning matched all the details the detectives already knew from speaking to Clayton and also looking over Big Mike's phone records. But then Nate revealed something they had not expected. Nate said that as he was leaving, a woman arrived at the Millers' trailer. He said he'd never seen her before, but she looked like she was in her 50s, maybe around 5'4" tall, with a slender build and glasses and bangs. He said she had called out, "Hi, Val," as she entered the mobile home, and she greeted Nate as he was leaving. His best guess was that she was a customer, but she could have just been a friend. At that point, Nate said he drove off to meet up with his girlfriend, so he didn't know how long that woman had stayed at the trailer. The detectives got the feeling like things were speeding up again. They now had someone who was at the trailer during the 2-hour window when the shooting occurred. The detectives knew they had to speak to this woman, but they had to find her first. Strout and Peary told Nate that a department sketch artist would be in touch very soon to put together a sketch of this mysterious woman. And sure enough, by the time the two detectives were back at the office, they found that the artist and Nate had already linked up, and the sketch was complete. Looking at the sketch, the detectives thought this woman looked like she could be anyone. But there weren't a lot of people in this part of Maine to begin with, so if this woman was a local, there was a decent chance somebody would recognize her. On December 1st, 2009, so 3 days after the Millers' murder, the detectives hosted a press conference where they officially disclosed what many people already knew. The Millers' deaths had been ruled a double homicide. Then they also released the forensic sketch of the mystery woman, saying she was an important person of interest in the case. Anyone who recognized her was encouraged to call the investigators as soon as possible. Right after the press conference, police posted copies of the sketch all over town, while others went door to door asking if anyone knew the woman. And soon, calls started to come from people all around the state who said they did recognize her. The detectives were just starting to look into these tips when Matt Miller's girlfriend, Tanya, finally returned their call from 2 days ago. They asked her where Matt had been on the morning of the murders, wondering if she would confirm Matt's claim that she'd spent the morning driving around with him looking for gifts. But instead, Tanya insisted she had not been with Matt at all that morning. She said on Saturday morning, Matt had walked out the door without saying where he was going, and for the next 2 hours, nobody could reach him, which was extremely frustrating considering they were supposed to be getting ready for their daughter's birthday party that afternoon. She said he finally returned around noon, but refused to say where he'd been. The detectives were astonished. Matt had clearly lied to them, and his own girlfriend was now saying that she herself didn't know where Matt was during the time of the murders. They considered driving over to pick Matt up for questioning, but decided to hold off until they could gather more information. The detectives already knew Matt had a criminal record. There was an outstanding arrest warrant out for him for writing bad checks. But now, Strout and Peary wondered if he might be involved in more illegal activity. For the next 3 days, the detectives quietly contacted people throughout the area, pressing for information about Matt. And what they learned was that Matt was clearly addicted to prescription drugs and had recently begun selling personal items, including his own Xbox, so he could buy more. And Matt's older brother, Mike Jr., had told them that Matt had asked his father for a loan on the night before the murders, when the brothers had dropped by. Big Mike had apparently turned him down, most likely because he knew Matt would simply blow the money on drugs. But the most damning tip of all didn't have anything to do with Matt's addiction or his criminal past. A local resident told the detectives they'd seen Matt's white Ford Explorer in the vicinity of his parents' house on the morning of the murders. This was something Matt had never disclosed to the police, and it potentially put him at the scene during the 2-hour window when Big Mike and Val were murdered. At this point, Strout and Peary knew it was time to talk to Matt again. They were not quite ready to charge him with his parents' murders, but the facts were quickly stacking up against him. So on December 3rd, 5 days after the murders, they arrested Matt on that outstanding bounced check charge and brought him in for questioning. Once they put him in a room, they pushed him hard, telling him they knew he killed his parents. And Matt just denied everything, while at the same time becoming increasingly emotional. But after hours of intense interrogation, Matt stuck to his story that he never would hurt his parents, and even the detectives started to wonder if they had it wrong. So they ultimately sent Matt back to a holding cell and then stepped out of the interview room to regroup. And that's when they got a tip that reassured them they were on the right track. A local man called to say that on the evening before Big Mike and Val were killed, Matt had called him up looking to buy a gun. He even specified he wanted a .22 caliber pistol, which, according to the autopsy, was the type of gun used to commit the murders. The man said the firearm sale had not gone through, but the detectives figured Matt still could have kept on looking and eventually gotten his hands on a .22. With this new tip, the detectives marched back into the holding cell where Matt sat on his bed and told him what they'd learned. Matt immediately insisted that the tip was false, saying he never tried to buy a gun that night. But the stress of the interrogation was clearly wearing on him, and finally he broke down and confessed. Not to murdering his parents, but to lying about his alibi. He said that on the morning of the murders, he was meeting with a drug dealer not far from his parents' place. He bought some pills and then went into the woods to take them. He later lied about it because he didn't want to incriminate himself and because he was ashamed that he was off getting high while he was supposed to be getting ready for his daughter's first birthday party. Strout and Peary were skeptical of Matt's tearful confession, especially after all the lies, but they agreed to check out his new alibi and see if there was any truth to it. The detectives began by pulling security camera footage from businesses along the route Matt said he took. It was a very tedious process that took 2 full days, as the detectives scrubbed hours of footage looking for Matt's white Ford Explorer. Strout's eyes were starting to glaze over when Peary suddenly grabbed his shoulder and pointed at the screen. The footage showed a familiar car traveling away from the Miller's place at 11:25 a.m. on November 28th, the morning of the murders. The detectives stared at the grainy footage, slowly realizing what this meant. The footage conclusively showed that the car's driver had lied about their alibi and had been close to the trailer around the time the crime was committed. Strout and Peary leapt into action. They sent officers out to bring that driver in for questioning. But before the arrest warrant could ever be drawn up, Peary's phone rang. He answered it, and there was a woman on the line. Peary did not recognize her voice, but she told him she had vital information about the Miller's case. For a moment, Peary was ready to write this off as just another bad tip. He and Strout had been fielding calls all week from people who claimed to recognize the mystery woman from the forensic sketch, and every one of those calls had been a dead end. But this one was different. The caller didn't mention the mystery woman at all. Instead, she said she actually knew who killed Big Mike and Val. And as the detectives listened to her story, the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene, security camera footage, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Michael and Valerie Miller on the morning of November 28, 2009. Early that morning, the killer was home in their apartment, rifling through drawers in search of something, anything, that they could quickly turn into cash. They'd already pawned or sold their video game console, DVD player, and sound system, along with pretty much everything else of value. Now they were broke again and getting desperate. Suddenly, their hand closed around a metal grip. They pulled the object from the drawer, and they felt a rush of exhilaration as they stared down at the .22 caliber pistol in their hand. It wasn't what they'd initially planned to sell, but this gun could get them all the cash they needed. A few hours later, the killer was standing in the Millers' mobile home, talking to Big Mike in the kitchen. After their desperate morning search, the killer finally felt calm. Finally, the conversation with Big Mike moved past chit-chat to business. The killer pulled the pistol from their jacket and held it out, asking how much Big Mike could offer for it. The killer wasn't here to shoot Big Mike. They had come to pawn the gun. Big Mike looked the weapon over thoughtfully, then gave his answer. The killer blinked, then shrugged and nodded, feeling a bit disappointed. It was less than they had hoped for, but probably a fair offer for the tiny pistol. Big Mike handed the gun back over and said he would need to grab his business ledger from the storage room, and then he turned, but before Mike took a single step, the killer's finger brushed against the trigger. The hammer was still cocked from Big Mike's examination, and the gun went off. The killer jumped from surprise as Big Mike collapsed, his enormous body slumping to the floor of the kitchen. Val screamed and rushed into the room, instantly dropping to her husband's side. In an instant, the killer realized what they'd just done. They had shot Big Mike in the head. Maybe Val would believe this was an accident. Maybe she wouldn't. But right now, all the killer wanted was for her screaming to stop. Without really understanding why, the killer raised the gun and fired, this time on purpose. Val's scream was cut short as a bullet hit her in the head, and she collapsed onto her husband. The killer just stared down at the crumpled bodies, horrified by what they'd just done. The situation felt so unreal, but as the seconds ticked by and Big Mike and Val didn't move, the killer knew they were dead. Then, the killer realized that if they didn't want to spend the rest of their life in prison, they would need to get out of the mobile home right now. And they were about to flee when a thought suddenly struck them. They came here for money, and Big Mike would not be needing money anymore. Besides, it might be good for the killer if the police thought the shooting was part of a robbery. So, the killer ran for the storage room. They threw the door open and stood there for a moment, taking stock of the guns and electronics. The killer knew they couldn't carry very much, so they decided to take the safe. Before leaving, the killer stopped to consider Big Mike's business ledgers. They knew these books would include the sizable loans the killer had taken out from him in the past. And this made the killer nervous. So the killer quickly flipped through the pages of the ledger books until they found one containing their own name. They tucked that ledger under their arm, picked up the small but heavy safe, and left the storage room. They avoided looking at the bodies on the kitchen floor as they shuffled past, and they just continued to drag the safe out of the mobile home back to their car. Before leaving, they doubled back to lock the trailer's door. With any luck, that would delay the bodies from being discovered, and hopefully buy the killer a bit more time. A few minutes later, the killer was speeding away, and they were so focused on just getting out of town that they didn't notice the closed-circuit cameras aimed at the road. When Detective Strout and Detective Peary reviewed the camera footage 2 weeks later, they didn't see the white Ford Explorer they were looking for, because Matt Miller was not the killer. It was Nate Nightingale, the best friend of Mike Jr., who the Millers had treated almost like a third son. The woman who had called in with a hot tip was Nate's girlfriend. and she told Strout and Peary that Nate had come to her and confessed to the crime. Nate was arrested on December 12th, and shortly after that, he would admit to everything. He said he really had gone to the Miller's place intending to pawn the gun. He needed the money so he could go Christmas shopping with his girlfriend. But while he was showing the gun to Big Mike, it went off by mistake, and when he realized what he had done, he panicked and intentionally killed Val. Nate also admitted to fabricating the story about the mystery woman. He said she was just a red herring to keep the police off his tail. She didn't exist. Detective Strout and Peary didn't like to admit this, but Nate's ploy almost worked. The search for that mystery woman burned up a lot of their time, and if they hadn't stumbled upon the security camera footage of Nate's car, it might have saved him. But now that they knew the truth, they looked at the forensic illustration again, and they noticed something they hadn't before. The woman in the sketch looked shockingly similar to Nate Nightingale himself, down to the narrow face, thin nose, and glasses. Nate had intended to throw the police off his trail with this mystery woman, but as he gave them details for the sketch, he sort of subconsciously wound up describing himself. It was almost like his guilt over murdering the people who helped raise him was so great, he could not let himself get away with it. Nate was sentenced to 40 years in prison for murdering Val. Big Mike's death was treated as manslaughter, for which Nate received 15 years to be served concurrently. Big Mike and Val's sons, Mike Jr. and Matt, sat stone-faced at the sentencing, while Nate tearfully apologized for destroying their family. Neither brother responded, but they stayed and watched while he was led away in handcuffs. Ever since, the two brothers have celebrated Matt's daughter's birthday a week early so that on November 28th, they can also remember their parents. On the morning of March 11th, 1900, 43-year-old Carrie Selvage stared out her bedroom window into the front yard of the building where she lived in Indianapolis, Indiana. The sun shined bright on her face, but it was surprisingly cold for March, and there was a chill in Carrie's room. She wore a heavy flannel blue dress and slippers, but she still shivered as she stood by the window. Carrie heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw a young woman standing there. Carrie smiled, exposing her gold filling and several false teeth that she barely even noticed anymore. The young woman smiled back and then put her hand on Carrie's shoulder. To someone walking by, this might have looked like two friends enjoying the view outside the window. But that's not what was happening here. Because the building where Carrie lived was not her home. It was the Union State Hospital, a turn-of-the-century sanitarium, which today would be called a psychiatric hospital. Carrie was a patient, and the young woman standing with Carrie was a nurse, whose job was to keep an eye on Carrie basically all the time. And Carrie hated it here. Up until a year ago, Carrie had been a school teacher, saving money and building a life for herself. But over time, Carrie had become overwhelmed and sad, and she couldn't even explain why. She felt tired, but she struggled to sleep, and there were days when she just felt sort of frozen, like she couldn't leave the house. Doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong with Carrie other than some problems with her vision and her teeth. So, the doctors did something that was unfortunately pretty common at this time for women. They diagnosed Carrie with hysteria and told her family to put her in an institution. That was how Carrie had lost her teaching job and her freedom and ended up living here at Union State. Now, in Carrie's room, the nurse told her that she had to go check on another patient. She told Carrie not to go anywhere until she got back. Carrie nodded and watched the nurse walk out of the room and close the door behind her. Once Carrie was alone again, she turned back to the window and looked outside. Her eyesight was terrible, so the view was not clear, but she could still make out people down below on the sidewalk walking past her. They looked like little blurs, but she watched each one for as long as she could. She felt jealous of these people, out walking by themselves. Carrie desperately wanted to go somewhere on her own, where nurses and doctors weren't hovering over her every few minutes and telling her what she could and couldn't do. She pressed her face up against the window, picturing the city she had once known so well. The streetcar rolling down its tracks, people rushing off to work, her students yelling and laughing in the schoolyard. And as she was having these thoughts, something else suddenly popped into her mind. She believed there was one particular place where, if she could just get there, she could once again experience the freedom she longed for. Just then, Carrie turned away from the window and walked over to her door. She opened the door halfway and leaned her head out, making sure nobody was in the hallway. Once she was sure the coast was clear, Carrie took a breath, lowered her head, and walked out of her room. About 5 minutes later, that same nurse came back to Carrie's room and opened the door. But now, Carrie's room was empty. The nurse walked over to the closet, opened the door, and checked inside, but Carrie wasn't in there either. The nurse wasn't alarmed. She was annoyed. Carrie had run away once before, and this nurse knew that if it happened again, she was going to have to explain why she left Carrie alone. The nurse checked the porch, where she knew Carrie liked to spend time, but it was also empty. She told herself what must have happened was a doctor came by and took Carrie somewhere. But when this nurse tracked down all the doctors on the shift, they all said the same thing. They hadn't seen Carrie all morning. Now, this nurse was starting to panic. She worried that Carrie might have tried to walk somewhere on her own and gotten completely lost because of her terrible eyesight. And so, not knowing what else to do, the nurse ran to the front desk and said she needed help right away, because Carrie Selvage had disappeared. At 6 p.m. that night, so about 8 hours after Carrie had stepped out of her room, her younger brother Joseph walked into the lobby of Union State Hospital, and it was pure chaos. Joseph saw doctors, nurses, and administrators walking as quickly as they could down one hall and into another, and everybody looked frantic. But nobody had contacted Joseph, so he did not know what was going on. He eventually flagged down a nurse and told her he was there to visit his sister, and that's when the nurse told him. His sister Carrie was missing. Joseph felt a pang of fear. He asked the nurse sharply what she meant. The nurse was clearly nervous as she explained that Carrie had wandered off. But she rushed to tell Joseph the entire staff believed that Carrie was probably still on the grounds, so there was no real need to worry. Joseph stared at the nurse with his mouth open. He was shocked. But more than that, he was mad. He had felt terrible for his big sister that she had ended up in this hospital in the first place, and he hadn't given up hope that she could maybe recover and return to the life that she had been building. He knew she was unhappy here, and now she was potentially in danger. Joseph collected himself enough to speak and said to the nurse, "Go get the police." Later that night, Detectives Chauncey Manning and Adolph Ashe of the Indianapolis Police Department arrived at Union State Hospital. Both men wore dark, well-tailored suits and hats. They were experienced investigators and had worked as partners on a range of cases. The detectives quickly met with the medical staff, who gave them a rundown of Carrie's known movements. The detectives also found Carrie's brother, Joseph, standing in a common room by the porch. He had refused to go home and was insisting that he wanted to be part of the search. Because no one had actually seen Carrie leave, the detectives decided the first priority was to search the hospital itself, even though staff had already looked. So, with Joseph and several other hospital employees following them, Detectives Manning and Ashe checked every patient's room one by one, including the closets. Then, after they did not find Carrie, they walked through the common areas and offices, bending down to search behind every piece of furniture. And when that didn't work, lastly they searched the stairways and took oil lamps up to the attic. But again, there was no sign of Carrie. Finally, Detective Manning told Joseph that they couldn't do much more tonight, but he promised that they would resume and expand their search for his sister first thing in the morning. What they didn't tell Joseph was that if Carrie had truly wandered off the hospital grounds and out into the city, then she was in very serious danger. Like other major cities, Indianapolis had its share of crime. Pickpockets and thieves were common, and violence against women was a growing problem. Carrie would be an easy target. But beyond that, at this particular moment, the city was also dealing with a truly bizarre rash of crimes. A gang of grave robbers were digging up bodies and then selling them on the black market to hospitals and universities that use the bodies for medical research. And in some cases, if a fresh body was required, these gangs would take things into their own hands and actually commit murder in order to provide that body. On the morning of March 12th, so still less than 24 hours after Carrie had gone missing, Detectives Manning and Ashe, along with a group of uniformed police officers, began canvassing the surrounding neighborhood outside of the hospital, hoping they weren't already too late. and pretty quickly they began finding witnesses. A young boy who'd been outside at the time when Carrie had disappeared said he did see a woman in a blue dress, just like the one Carrie was wearing, running down the street right across from the hospital. And a woman who lived nearby said she'd also seen the woman wandering down the street a couple blocks away. Now, this information didn't make it any clearer where Carrie was right now, but it at least gave the detectives some hope that they were finally on her trail. So the detectives wanted to get Carrie's image in front of as many people as possible. But back in 1900, reproducing photographs was not nearly as fast or easy a process as it is today. However, photography had recently become more affordable for people, and newspapers regularly ran photos along with their articles. So, the detectives met with Carrie's brother, Joseph, and got photos of Carrie that they could reproduce as cards to show people around the city. They would also put these photos in the local papers. In the week following Carrie's disappearance, Manning, Ash, and their team walked the city, knocked on doors, and showed Carrie's picture to everyone. But nobody else beyond those initial witnesses had seen her. 2 weeks after Carrie's disappearance, on March 25th, the detectives still had no real leads, and they were getting desperate. By now, they had searched the hospital and its grounds several times. They had crisscrossed the city, dragged small ponds, and conducted hundreds of interviews. At this point, they could only think of one other place to look: the canal that cut through town, that also was not far from the psychiatric hospital. In 1900, very few women were taught how to swim, so Manning and Ash thought Carrie might have wandered near the canal, and with her limited vision, and potentially with her inability to swim, she could have not seen the water, fallen in, and drowned. So the detectives had city workers drain the entire canal. And then after it was drained, they led a group of volunteers through the mud looking for Carrie's body. But after hours and hours of searching, they hadn't found any sign of her. As more weeks passed with no new leads or evidence, the search began to lose momentum. Carrie's brother, Joseph, had started his own campaign, going to different newspapers and asking them to keep putting photos of Carrie front and center. Through his efforts, thousands of people had seen Carrie's photograph, which was a shocking level of publicity for the year 1900. Carrie's face was by now well known across the city. But despite all this, by April of 1900, so about a month after Carrie's disappearance, the newspapers and detectives moved on, and Carrie's case went cold. Joseph and his family never stopped believing that Carrie was out there somewhere, and so every so often, over the next several months, they would put an article in the paper with a message to Carrie in it, promising that if she came out of hiding, she wouldn't have to go back to the hospital. She could come home instead. But Carrie never did. Fast forward 2 years to a day in September of 1902, inside of an operating theater at a hospital right near the one Carrie had disappeared from. A medical student wove through the crowd to a front row seat in the theater, which gave him a clear view of the operating room right below. The student felt his heart speed up, because in the center of the operating room, he saw a table covered with a bright white sheet, and he knew that underneath that sheet, there was a dead body. He and his fellow medical students had come to the operating theater today to watch a skilled surgeon dissect a real human corpse. This demonstration was, at the time, one of the only ways that doctors in training could gain a better understanding of human anatomy. And it was considered a huge privilege for them to get to witness something like this. The sound of footsteps echoed from below, and immediately the audience fell silent. The student saw the surgeon approach the operating table, and he listened closely as the surgeon explained what they could all expect to see during this demonstration. Then the student watched as the surgeon stepped up to the operating table and removed the white sheet, revealing the pale face of the corpse underneath, with a gold tooth glinting from its open mouth. The student had expected to feel amazement when he saw the body, but instead he felt an unsettling wave of déjà vu. Something about the corpse's face looked familiar to him, but he just couldn't place it. Then, suddenly, it just came to him, and he yelled it out without even meaning to. "It's the missing woman!" he shouted. Some of his classmates laughed uncomfortably, thinking maybe he was making a very bad joke. But the surgeon called for quiet and asked the student what he was talking about. The student stood up and said he would recognize that face anywhere. The woman on the table was Carrie Selvage, the same Carrie Selvage who had disappeared from the psychiatric hospital a couple years ago. Her photograph had been plastered all over the city. Suddenly, all the other students in the operating theater all began talking at once as they leaned forward to get a better look. They all remembered the missing woman, whose brother had given what felt like 50 interviews. And they agreed the corpse on the table looked just like Carrie, down to the gold tooth. Eventually, the surgeon called out to the students to quiet down and clear out of the operating theater. The surgeon had no idea if the med student was right, but he was not about to continue with this demonstration until he checked. A few hours later, Detectives Manning and Ash stood in the operating theater with the surgeon, Carrie's brother Joseph, and Carrie's dentist. All the men stared at the body on the table, and they all had the same reaction. It could be Carrie, but they weren't sure. The medical school had not kept great records on when it actually acquired these bodies. This particular one was slightly decomposed and had been frozen for a long time. The dentist eventually spoke up and said the gold filling was the same kind he'd used for Carrie, and it was in the exact same spot in her mouth. At this, Detectives Manning and Ash walked away from the table and huddled together in a corner to whisper to each other, occasionally taking a look back to make sure nobody, especially not Joseph, was listening. They did this because what they were discussing was incredibly upsetting. Manning and Ash knew that medical schools and hospitals had a hard time acquiring dead bodies for research through legal means, so these institutions often turned to the black market and grave robbers for their supply. In fact, during the initial investigation, they had worried that Carrie might have been the victim of grave robbers who were known to occasionally commit murder in order to increase their supply of dead bodies. Now, the detectives knew they were going to have to step into this dark, bizarre world of grave robbers to get answers. And there was one man in particular they were going to have to talk to. His name was Rufus Cantrell, but the media and the police called him the King of Ghouls. Rufus Cantrell was actually already in jail, so it was easy for Manning and Ash to find him. In just a few hours after they had stood over the corpse in the operating theater, they walked into an office in the jail and sat down at a table across from the man they thought could break their case open for them. Now, Rufus had a reputation for being violent and sort of unhinged, so the detectives were surprised that he was in a very relaxed, almost jovial mood when they met him. He told Manning and Ash that he would help them in any way he could. Manning was suspicious of this level of cooperation, but he still told Rufus all about the dead woman in the operating theater, doing his best to describe the woman's appearance and her teeth. Rufus nodded along as Manning spoke, and then when Manning was done, Rufus said he knew exactly who the detective was talking about. That was the woman who'd gone missing from the psychiatric hospital over 2 years ago. Manning looked at Rufus skeptically and asked how he could be so sure, and then he watched as a wide, unsettling smile spread across the King of Ghouls' face. Rufus said he was sure because members of the grave robbing gang he was a part of had murdered her. At this, Manning and Ash just stood there, staring in shock at the grave robber in front of them. The detectives had come here expecting a very confrontational interview, not an immediate and creepily cheerful confession. They actually didn't even know what to say. So, after a moment of silence, Rufus just kept on talking. He said he personally had not had anything to do with the murder. All he knew was that his band of grave robbers had spotted a woman in a blue dress wandering along a country road and decided she was an easy target. And they had been right. They had attacked her and then dragged her to a house they worked out of in the city, and once they got there, they clubbed her to death, and then put out the word in their network that they had a fresh body for sale. Rufus said that was when he had found out about this, around the time they were actually trying to sell the body. He said that all he had done was actually help arrange the sale of Carrie Selvage's body to the hospital. And then after her body had been sold, it would sit frozen for 2 full years until finally, today, it had been scheduled for dissection. Detectives Manning and Ash left the jail feeling a bit blindsided. They knew there were countless reasons not to trust Rufus. He was already in jail, for one thing, and probably thought that talking to detectives, especially about a case they were really interested in, might get him out. And then there was the fact that this guy, Rufus, had literally sold dead bodies on the black market, and he was possibly a total psychopath. But the murder scenario Rufus had outlined was something the detectives themselves had considered. And in the weeks following that interview, the detectives actually had Rufus lead them, along with Carrie's brother Joseph, to the house where Rufus claimed the murder took place. And there they would find a club, as well as pieces of women's clothing. So, although Manning and Ash still remained skeptical of Rufus's story, the King of Ghouls had given them just enough evidence to finally close the case. Carrie Selvage was officially declared dead. But there was just one problem, and that was that Carrie's brother, Joseph, absolutely refused to believe it. Now, Joseph didn't have a good alternate theory about what happened to his sister, but the grave robber story made no sense to him. Carrie had bad eyesight and she was generally nervous and unhappy, but she wasn't stupid. She had grown up in the city and knew not to wander alone at night down country roads. Plus, he knew Rufus had gotten a lighter sentence in return for his story and cooperation, so how true could it really be? And also, part of Joseph just wanted to believe that his sister had escaped the hospital and found the freedom she so desperately wanted and was now off living happily and choosing not to let anyone find her. And Joseph would hold on to this belief for a long time, until on April 26, 1920, so over 20 years after Carrie's disappearance. On that day, Joseph got an urgent and confusing telephone call from the police at his home. An officer said he'd heard from a construction company that was working on a building in town. It was an orphanage that they were converting to an automobile repair shop, and this construction crew had found something that Joseph just needed to see. Joseph ended the call and headed straight to the building, having no idea what he was about to find. Once outside the orphanage, Joseph walked past several construction workers and then stepped inside the building. Right away, he heard somebody call his name, and he looked over to see a man with thinning white hair walking towards him. Joseph squinted, looked at the man's face, and then suddenly he recognized him. It was Detective Manning. Now Joseph felt a jolt of adrenaline. Whatever this was, it had to be about his sister. Joseph asked Manning if Detective Ash was here too, but Manning just shook his head and said no, Ash had passed away a few years earlier. Before the two men could really talk, they were joined by a member of the construction crew, who handed them each a flashlight and gestured for them to follow him. As Joseph walked through the building, he could see that the construction crew had already made a lot of progress, but it still looked like parts of the building hadn't changed in decades, and it was one of these old, untouched areas of the building where this crew member led Joseph and Manning. And when they got there, the crew member pointed to an old stairwell set against a wall, signaling for Joseph to climb up the stairs. Joseph hesitated, but only for a second. Then he took a deep breath and slowly walked up the steps. When he reached the top, he found himself standing in a dark, narrow hallway with a low ceiling that made him feel totally claustrophobic. Joseph bent down, but it still felt like the ceiling was pressing in on him. And as he walked down this hallway, shining his flashlight from side to side, it almost looked like the walls were closing in. Joseph felt his chest tightening. This place was cramped and pitch black, and even though he knew it was ridiculous, he had this feeling like he could get stuck here. But finally, his light caught something at the end of the hallway. It was a small door built into the wall ahead of him, and it looked just big enough for him to fit through. Joseph reached the end of the hall and caught his breath. Then he opened the door and squeezed through. He stumbled forward and found himself inside of a cold, damp room that was only about 4 feet by 6 feet. But unlike the hallway, it wasn't dark and stuffy. Instead, sunlight flooded this room through 2 windows. It was bright and the air was fresh. Joseph flipped off his flashlight and began turning in a slow circle, surveying the room. And halfway through the circle, he froze. At this moment, Joseph knew he had been right for decades. That grave robber, the King of Ghouls, Rufus Cantrell, had lied. The body on that table in the operating theater had not been his sister's. Because leaning against the wall inside of the small room, Joseph saw the skeletal remains of a woman, with tattered pieces of a blue flannel dress clinging to her bones and 2 old slippers lying at her feet. Joseph turned away from the skeleton towards the window. Through it, he could see almost the entire city. And Joseph started crying. Because now he understood that as much as he'd wanted to believe it, his sister Carrie had never escaped and found her freedom. Because it would turn out that the orphanage that Joseph had come to, where he climbed the old stairwell and found his sister's body, had once been the Union State Hospital, the psychiatric institution where Carrie had been committed. The hospital had shut down not long after Carrie disappeared, and the building had been used for several different things in the years that followed. And now, the construction crew that was converting it into an automobile repair shop had discovered this old staircase by accident. And that staircase led to a tiny hidden room that was located up above the attic, and that had windows to the outside. Joseph and the detectives had searched the hospital attic on the day Carrie went missing, but they hadn't noticed this staircase. So they didn't know that Carrie had actually been right there, just above them, the whole time. The official report on Carrie's death would later conclude that her terrible eyesight had led her to become lost and wind up in this room and not know how to get out again, and then she froze to death. But, as always, Joseph did not accept the official statement. In fact, he would spend years coming up with theories of his own. But there was one theory that couldn't be ignored, and that was that maybe Carrie didn't get confused and stuck inside the room because she couldn't see. Maybe, when she crawled into that secret room, she had known exactly what she was doing. Because Carrie had almost certainly been alive throughout the entire search of the hospital. Staff, police, and her own brother had been just feet away. But she never once called out or made any noise. So maybe Carrie had just decided to sit there quietly, looking out the window and across the city where she'd once been free. And when night fell and she felt that bitter cold coming on, she chose to stay in that room. The only place she knew where she could be on her own and where nobody would tell her what she could and couldn't do. On April 30th, 1920, 4 days after the discovery of her remains, Carrie Selvage was buried next to her mother and finally laid to rest. As for the two witnesses who said they had seen Carrie basically right after she had gone missing, running down the street, had simply been mistaken. And the dead woman who had been on the operating table at the Westside Medical Clinic was never identified. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. On the evening of January 3rd, 1991, a 40-year-old mountain climber named Yi Song felt the wind and snow whipping against his face as he stared up at a mountain peak jutting through the clouds high above him. Yi was standing more than 2/3 of the way up a mountain called Kawa, which is the highest mountain in the Meilin Snow Mountain Range in southwest China. Kawa stands at an elevation of about 22,000 feet, which is more than 4 miles, and nobody in recorded history had ever reached its peak. In fact, the Tibetan villagers who lived at the base of this mountain believed that nobody ever would, and some of those villagers regularly tried to prevent would-be climbers from even trying. But Yi and the 17-member team of climbers he was helping to lead were determined to prove the villagers wrong, and to make history. They had started climbing this mountain a month earlier, and they were now closer to the peak of Kawa than anyone had ever gotten. Yi turned his gaze away from the peak and looked around the temporary camp where he and his team were planning to spend the night. He could see several climbers struggling to reinforce their tents against the snow and the wind. He and his team had chosen to climb at this time of year because it was known as the dry season, when major storms were actually rare. So Yi couldn't understand why the snow just kept coming down. He grabbed his radio off his belt and called down to base camp, which was a camp at the foot of the mountain where other members of the team provided weather information and support to the climbers. Yi told a base camp team member that the snow was still unbelievably falling hard up here. That team member reminded him that the climbers should clear snow away from their tents at least every 2 hours. Yi was about to respond, but just then, his radio cut out, and he heard this loud buzzing sound coming from it. He stared down at his radio, confused. This was the sound it made when it needed a new battery, but he had just put a new battery in. Yi fumbled with the radio, trying to fix it, but all he could hear was this buzzing sound, and then also, periodically, he'd hear the voice of the base camp team member cutting in and out. Yi communicated over the radio and wasn't sure if anyone heard it, but He said he was losing communication and he would try to contact them again later. Then Yi turned off his radio, clipped it to his belt, and the buzzing stopped. As the sun finished setting, the wind picked up even more. Yi craned his neck upwards again, and he saw that the peak of Kawagabawa had now disappeared in the snow and the darkness. Yi had done lots of difficult climbs in the past, and he was sort of used to running into problems right when he thought he was about to achieve his goals. That was just how mountains worked. All the planning in the world could not prepare climbers for everything. But for some reason, this felt different. This storm just didn't show any signs that it would ever let up. Yi lowered his head and walked towards a group of tents. He wanted to help his team clear snow away. But all of a sudden, Yi heard screaming coming from inside one of these tents. He and several other climbers moved as quickly as they could through the snow toward the sound. They stepped into the tent, and they saw a woman laying in her sleeping bag, and she was shivering uncontrollably, and sweat was running down her forehead. Yi knew this woman, who was one of several Japanese climbers on their team, had been dealing with a high fever for days. But now, she didn't just look sick, she looked terrified. As soon as Yi entered the tent, the woman stopped screaming, and she just started muttering. Yi knew some Japanese, but he couldn't make out what she was saying. He looked around the tent, and he could tell that the other Japanese climbers who had come in were also confused by the woman's words. Yi turned to one of them and asked, what is she saying? And in a little more than a whisper, the climber told Yi the woman was saying, "Something is coming." Later that night, the storm began to reach blizzard conditions as Yi made his way around the camp, checking on his team. As bad as the weather had gotten, and as alarming as the screaming Japanese woman had been, Yi refused to panic. He believed if everyone just stayed calm and prepared, they could make it through the night. But he quickly realized he was the only one who felt this way. Each climber Yi spoke to seemed as frightened as the woman with the fever. He tried his best to calm everyone down he spoke to, but nothing he did seemed to work. So eventually, he headed back towards his own tent to make sure it was secure. But before he got there, he heard more shouting. At first, Yi assumed it was the woman with the fever, but he listened more closely and he could tell it couldn't be, because it was a man's voice. Yi trudged back through the snow towards this shouting man's tent to see what was wrong, and when he stepped inside, Yi felt truly scared for the first time since he'd come to the mountain. Inside the tent, Yi saw one of the climbers sitting by a fire, pen and notebook clutched in his hands, and on his face was this wild look. His eyes were darting from one side of the tent to the other, and he would shout at something only he could see and hear. And then he would scribble furiously in his notebook. It was like he had lost his mind. Yi was so unsettled that he just backed out of the tent, and as soon as he was outside, he turned and began rushing back through the snow towards his tent. However, as he was between tents, he heard this loud rumbling sound, almost like the banging of a drum, coming from high up the mountain. He froze where he was, terrified, and he heard the sound of trees cracking and splitting, and he knew this must be it. This is the avalanche. However, when Yi looked up the mountain, expecting to see a mass of ice and rock barreling down the mountain towards them, all he could see was the falling snow and the black night sky. There was no avalanche. Early the next morning, January 4th, the snowstorm subsided, and the weather on Kawagabawa turned calm and sunny. A team leader down at base camp radioed up to Yi to see how the climbers fared over the night, but Yi didn't respond. So the team leader tried radioing the other members of the team that were up there with Yi as well, but they too didn't respond. And so this team leader sent out a small search team to see if they could get a visual of Yi and the other climbers he was with. However, remember, these climbers were thousands of feet up the mountain from base camp. So under the best of circumstances, it would have been really hard to look up and have seen them. And these were certainly not the best circumstances. There had been this huge snowstorm over the night, a snowstorm that really wasn't even supposed to happen this time of the year, which made getting a visual on Yi and his team nearly impossible. And so this team leader quickly realized that if the climbers had gotten lost up on the mountain, he didn't have the resources to mount an effective search. So he quickly informed multiple government agencies that his team was missing, and then the government took over. That day, the Chinese government launched a massive operation on Kawagabawa, Professional search and rescue teams worked with volunteers on the ground, and airplane and helicopter pilots circled the mountain. But after 2 weeks of this daily intense searching, it became clear Juryi and the rest of the climbers, along with any remnants of their camp, had disappeared. On January 22nd, so 18 days after the climbers had gone missing, rescuers abandoned the search, and the government issued an official statement. The statement said that while massive snowstorms were indeed rare for this time of the year, they were not actually impossible to occur. So officials said the storm likely caused an avalanche that wiped out the camp and buried the climbers somewhere they couldn't be found. Now, this explanation was very logical, and for most people, it marked the end of this very tragic story. But not for the villagers who lived at the base of Kawagabawa. These villagers, who didn't think anyone would ever summit the mountain, and who actively tried to stop those that did, they did not believe the official statement. They had a story of their own, which they were certain was the real explanation for what had happened to the climbers. And when the government issued its statement, these villagers tried to tell people that the government was wrong. And so, when climbers and tourists from all over came to Kawagabawa, these villagers told them what they believed actually happened, and how it would happen all over again if anyone tried to reach the mountain's peak. Now, most people dismissed the villagers' story as rumor or superstition, and that was a reasonable way to react to this, until 7 years later, when 3 shepherds from the village made a terrible discovery. 7 years later, on the afternoon of June 18, 1998, 3 shepherds were walking along a glacier near the base of Kawagabawa. This glacier was 2.5 miles away from where Juryi and the rest of his climbers had set up their final camp. But the shepherds were not there to do any kind of search. This glacier was located near their village, and it was home to a temple that they often visited. So they were talking and walking towards the temple when, just up ahead of them, one of the shepherds spotted something bright and colorful sticking up out of the ice. The group was intrigued, and they began walking towards it, thinking it might be a prayer flag. But as they got closer, and this colorful object came into focus, the group went quiet. And then the shepherds also saw there were other colored objects just like this one scattered around the area. These objects were the bodies of the climbers who had disappeared from Kawagabawa 7 years earlier, still wrapped in the colorful coats they'd been wearing when they headed up the mountain. But what the shepherds could not have known in this moment was that buried under the ice with the bodies was a diary, which one of the climbers had used to record the events of the ascent. It belonged to the climber that Juryi had seen shouting at an unseen force and scribbling furiously on the night they all vanished. And this diary would reveal that the stories the villagers told about Kawagabawa and the lost climbers were more than just legend. It would turn out there was a very specific reason why these Tibetan villagers believed nobody would ever reach the peak of Kawagabawa. It was because the peak was said to be a sacred place. It was the home of a warrior protector god, and because of this, it was not meant for human beings to climb. The villagers believed that if anyone ever approached the peak, it would wake the spirits of the mountain, and the mountain god would punish them. This punishment would lead to death, but it would not stop there, because the dead would become prisoners of the mountain for 7 years. And these villagers had made their beliefs very clear to Juryi and the rest of his team of climbers who wanted to be the first people to ever reach Kawagabawa's peak. In fact, a group of villagers had heavily protested their climb and warned the climbers that their expedition would anger the mountain god and result in tragedy. But Juryi and the rest of his climbers had not heeded their warnings. The diary of the climber that was discovered along with the bodies recounted what happened as a result. The diary started like a lot of climbing diaries do, an account of the day's hike, the scenery, the weather. But as the dates got closer to the night the climbers disappeared, the diary took a strange turn. The writer became obsessed with these shadows he saw walking across his tent, and he said he heard women laughing and babies crying all around him in the darkness. That woman who had screamed out, who was sick with a fever, had said she felt something bad was coming, and she had tried to warn the others. But by the time Juryi heard the sound like beating drums high up on the mountain that he thought was an avalanche, like many thought was an avalanche, the mountain god had apparently already unleashed his wrath. As soon as Juryi and those climbers had disappeared, The villagers all assumed that they had faced the wrath of the mountain god. But the fact that their bodies had remained hidden for 7 years, the length of time the mountain god keeps the dead imprisoned in the mountain, was all the proof the villagers needed to know they were right. And the climber who wrote the diary ended up believing them too, although it was too late. In his final diary entry, he wrote, quote, "We were wrong. They are coming. Run." In 2001, 10 years after the climbers had died on the mountain, the Chinese government banned all mountain climbing activities in the Meilin snow mountain range. To this day, still, nobody on record has ever actually set foot on the peak of Kawagabawa. Our next story is called Something in the Bushes. On a June day in 1953, a 31-year-old American doctor named George Moore stood in a small mountain campsite in Nepal, staring out at a massive rainstorm forming on the horizon. George had been in Nepal, which is a country south of China, for 8 months, leading a small medical team trying to stop the spread of diseases like malaria in villages all across the region. This was groundbreaking work in 1953, and it was starting to make George famous back home in America. And here in Nepal, he had already become a trusted figure among the villagers, many of whom had never seen a person from the West until they met George. But right now, a group of these villagers were scrambling to get George out of their village. And this was because of the storm that George was looking at. One of the villagers pointed at the clouds and told George this was not a regular thunderstorm. The monsoons were coming. And once the monsoons hit, the only dirt road that led back to George's base in the city of Kathmandu would flood very quickly. And the horrendous rains could last for months, which meant if George wanted to continue his work stopping disease in other parts of this region, he would have to get out right now. George had known the monsoon season was coming, but it had arrived much more quickly than he'd expected, and so he and his team were sort of caught off guard. The journey out of the village was not something they wanted to undertake suddenly with so little preparation, because they didn't have a car. They literally had to walk out, and so they needed to be fully prepared. And also, this dirt road out of the village went through a deep forest where the locals claimed it was inhabited by terrible monsters. Now, while George did not believe in the supernatural, he did think that, fantastical stories about monsters often started because of real-life animal attacks. And so, monsters or not, the forest was definitely dangerous, especially since they again would be on foot. But George knew they really didn't have any other choice. They did have to go right now. George quickly gathered up first aid kits, medicine, and supplies and put them into a large pack. Then he reached down, pulled a revolver out of the holster on his hip, and spun the chamber to make sure the gun was fully loaded. And when he saw all 6 bullets, he knew he was as ready as he was going to be. George holstered his gun, thanked the villagers for their help, and then turned to lead his team out. But as he stepped onto the road, one of the villagers grabbed his arm to stop him. Then they pointed towards a spot on the mountain above the road that George and his team needed to take, and George looked up and saw large billows of smoke rising above the trees and into the sky. In a strained voice, the villager told him that no matter what, George and his team must not go anywhere near where that smoke was. The storm continued to move in as George and his team began their journey. The men were getting wet and muddy, and the thunder was so loud it made their bodies feel like they were vibrating. But the rain really was not their biggest problem. Because by the time they had gotten maybe a mile or so from the village, a thick fog had rolled in and covered the entire road. And then suddenly, it was like the fog got so intense that George couldn't even see his team anymore. George did his best to try to walk as straight as he could, doing his best to stay on the road, but the fog at this point was so intense, he couldn't even see the ground, so he didn't even know if he was on the road. And then in the back of his head, he couldn't help but have this fear that because he didn't know where he was going and couldn't see his team, that he would unwittingly walk over to the place where that smoke was coming from. But he reassured himself that that couldn't possibly happen because the smoke looked really far away when they had set out, and this fog had only really rolled in for the last couple of minutes, so there's no way he could have gone all the way over there. But as George stumbled along, bumping into trees and feeling totally disoriented, the fog only seemed to grow thicker. The sound of the wind and the rain swirled around him, and George started to feel really disoriented, like he was in a dream or something. Then this horrific shriek cut through the pounding of the rain and the howling of the wind. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded like a wild animal, although George had no idea what kind it was. But George didn't need to know what this animal was to know it was a threat, and he needed to get away from it fast. So he turned and just began hustling in the direction away from the sound. But again, he could barely see. He was bumping into trees, he was stumbling on rocks. At this point, he knew he was well off the dirt road, but had no way of getting back to it. He didn't know where his team was, he called out to them, but didn't hear back. I mean, he's totally panicking at this point. And after a few minutes of trekking away from that shrieking sound, suddenly something huge and dark loomed up in front of George. For a second, he flinched, like somehow that shrieking animal had paced around him and now was stopping his way. But then he realized what he was seeing was actually this huge boulder. Frantically, he began climbing the boulder, thinking if he got to higher ground, he'd be safe from whatever was shrieking behind him. And as George climbed, he heard a voice call out to him. It was a member of his team. It was an entomologist. And amazingly, he was right behind George, standing at the base of the boulder. George just hadn't seen or heard him. The entomologist also seemed panicked and began climbing as well, and while he did, he shouted to George that he'd just heard movement coming from the plants. And so whatever animal was out here that this entomologist had also heard was clearly close by. George and the entomologist made it to the top of the boulder. They stood there, shivering and muddy, still surrounded by fog. George could feel his heart pounding, but he tried to hold his breath and not make a sound. The two men listened, trying desperately to hear any sign of this creature that had shrieked. But there was no more sound. It was silent. But seconds later, the men heard a new sound. It was like something was moving quickly through nearby bushes down below the boulder. George and the entomologist crouched down, trying desperately to see what was down there. And as they did, they saw the shadow run through the fog. On instinct, George put his hand on the grip of his gun, but he didn't draw, and now neither of the men moved a muscle. Then another noise came from the fog. George thought it sounded like grunts and teeth chattering. For a second, everything fell silent again. Then George heard heavy footsteps nearby. He started to shake with fear, but at the same time, he was desperate to see what was coming. So he leaned forward over the boulder as much as he could, trying to look down to see what this thing was. And suddenly, through the fog, he saw a pair of bright yellow eyes staring right back up at him. George tried to get back up, but it was like he was frozen. He just crouched there staring at the eyes in the fog. And slowly, he saw more pairs of yellow eyes appear in the fog. And he saw shadows of what looked like long tails whipping back and forth. Instantly, George thought of the monsters from the villagers' stories. But he told himself that's ridiculous. These were clearly just langur monkeys. He reminded himself that he was a doctor, a scientist. There had to be a rational explanation. These were just animals. They couldn't be monsters. But then one of these creatures moved forward and put its claw on the boulder and began to climb up. And at this point, George finally got a clear look at it. He saw this thing stood at least 5 feet tall, much bigger than any of the langur monkeys or any other monkeys that inhabited this forest. And instead of fur, it had gray skin. But most terrifying was its mouth, which was unnaturally large, stretching almost from ear to ear. And it was filled with these sharp teeth, the same color as its eyes. And as this creature slowly began to ascend the boulder, George felt a level of fear he had never experienced. Something primitive from deep down inside of him. A single terrifying thought blared in his mind. These creatures are not of the natural world. These creatures are godly. Now George screamed and drew his gun. He was too afraid to aim it at the creatures directly, so he pointed it up into the air and began shooting. The creatures let out a chorus of these horrible shrieks, the same shrieks they had heard earlier. Then he watched as the creatures turned, and their shadows and their yellow eyes disappeared back into the fog. George and the entomologist stayed huddled on top of that boulder, too terrified to move, for what felt like hours. Those creatures did not come back, and eventually the rest of George's team found him and the entomologist. The two men scrambled down from the boulder, and they joined the group. The team asked them what happened. They said that, George and the entomologist had gotten too far ahead of them in the fog, and they'd lost them. then they heard the gunshots. But all George could say was, "We have to get out of here right now. I will explain later." And as the team set off again, George took a second and turned back around and looked in the direction of the boulder, where he and the entomologist had seen these creatures. And now that he had a little more perspective and the fog had cleared just a little bit, he saw something that he hadn't seen before. That column of smoke that he had been warned not to go anywhere near was coming up right from behind the boulder. He and the entomologist accidentally fled to the exact spot they were told not to go. That night, after a long hike, George and his team finally made it to their base. And it was only when he was back in the safety of his camp, with friendly villagers all around him, that George was able to finally think clearly again about what he had just experienced, with the strange creatures in that place where the smoke was. He didn't know what to make of it. George was a United States Army veteran and a man of science. He didn't believe in monsters or terrible gods roaming the forests. But he told his story as accurately as he could to the villagers, hoping they would have some realistic explanation for what the creatures were. But what the villagers had to say only left George feeling even more unsettled. So George decided he was just not going to speak of what he had seen to anyone anymore. He had a bright future ahead of him as a doctor. He wasn't going to throw it away by making himself look crazy. And so when he got to America, and people asked him about his time in Nepal, he would tell them a wild story about this chance run-in with a group of langur monkeys. But the true memory of the creatures he actually saw out there, which were not langur monkeys, at least not to him, never left George. Their height, their yellow eyes, their huge mouths and sharp teeth, and the pure fear George had felt in their presence. George was a man of science, which made him want to forget this encounter. But he was also a man of truth, and so after spending years with these memories in his head, George came to believe that he had a duty to tell the truth about what he actually saw, no matter what the consequences were. And so in 1957, 4 years after his encounter in Nepal, Dr. George Moore published a first-hand account of what he had seen in a magazine article that was titled, "I Met the Abominable Snowman." In this article, he explained that the place on the mountain where the smoke was rising, where the villagers warned George not to enter, was called the House of the Gods, and the House of the Gods was home to the Yeti. A Yeti is an ape-like creature said to live in the Himalayas, and is similar to Bigfoot, but thought to be a bit shorter. In the West, the Yeti is often referred to as the Abominable Snowman. And in his article, George said he'd come face to face with a pack of them in Nepal. Telling the world what he'd seen did not adversely affect George like he'd feared. He went on to have a long, successful career and is still considered a pioneer in the field of medical outreach. And because of George's standing as a doctor and researcher, his encounter in Nepal has remained one of the most highly credible cryptid sightings in modern history. And so, as much as some explorers and scientists might think we can fully understand the natural world, both of these stories are proof that you can't.
On the night of September 21st, 2013, 39-year-old Joe Connell clinked his fork against a champagne glass to get the attention of his friends and family, who were sitting together on a restaurant patio in Wilmington, Delaware. Everyone at the large table quieted down as Joe stood up and raised his glass. He looked over at his wife Olga sitting right by him, and he smiled at her. Then he cleared his throat and made a toast. He said that he still couldn't believe that he'd been lucky enough to meet and marry a beautiful, brilliant woman like Olga. And he was so excited to be there with the people they loved to wish her a happy 39th birthday. Everyone at the table shouted happy birthday, toasted Olga, and then drank their champagne. Olga blushed, and Joe laughed a bit. He knew how shy his wife could be when the attention was on her. But he sat down and put his arm around her and told her that she deserved all the attention. After all, this was her special day. A few minutes later, as the group was talking and eating, Joe felt his phone buzz in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw there was a text message. He read it, then quickly replied, and then jumped back into the conversation at the table. But pretty much right away, loud music began playing from inside the restaurant, and Olga immediately got excited. The music meant that the dance floor in this large restaurant and bar was now open, and the dance floor was one of the big reasons they'd chosen this place to celebrate here in the first place. Because as shy as Olga was in a lot of social situations,
she actually loved to let loose and dance. And so Joe instinctively stood up, looked over at his wife, and took her hand, and then together they walked inside the restaurant. Once inside, they immediately hit the dance floor, and for a minute, Joe just stood there, watching his wife dance. She had beautiful blonde hair, she was wearing a nice dress, and she had on sparkling pieces of expensive jewelry. Joe had meant every word in his short birthday toast. He really couldn't believe how lucky he was to be married to this woman. The couple had met online about 3 years earlier, when Joe was just coming out of the craziest and most difficult period of his life. Joe had gotten into this drunken brawl and ended up pulling out a gun, and the police got involved. Joe had said the gun was not loaded, but that event still had landed Joe in prison for almost 6 years. And when he'd gotten out, he'd vowed to clean up his life. And pretty quickly after getting out, 2 things made that possible. One, he'd become co-owner of an auto repair shop with his best friend Chris, and 2, he'd met Olga. Joe and Olga had gotten along right away, and so they quickly set up a date. And as soon as they hung out in person, Joe thought Olga was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, and one of the smartest people he'd ever met. Olga had grown up in Russia, and while she was there, she'd received college degrees in physics and chemistry. Now, Joe never thought of himself as being a particularly smart guy. He thought he was just a really good car mechanic. But Olga, she fell for him the same way he fell for her. She thought he was funny and outgoing, and it didn't hurt that she thought he was handsome and in great shape. And so, not long after their initial meeting, they moved in together, and then eventually, in June of 2013, they got married, just a few months before Olga's 39th birthday. Back on the dance floor, Joe shouted over the loud music and told his wife how amazing she looked tonight. Olga wrapped her arms around his neck, and they started dancing together. And before they knew it, hours had flown by. The dance floor had all but cleared, and the restaurant staff was now starting to shut things down for the night. Joe and Olga said goodbye to the few friends who'd stayed to dance with them, and then they too left the restaurant. On the drive home, Joe and Olga talked and laughed, still wired from their night out. But at one point, Joe got this sad look on his face, and Olga asked if something was wrong. Joe shook his head and said he was just sorry that his little sister Kelly hadn't been at the party. Olga didn't say it, but she knew that Kelly hadn't just missed the party. Kelly had not been invited. Because Joe and his younger sister were in the middle of a full-on feud, and they had completely stopped talking to each other. And as much as it upset Joe not to have Kelly in his life anymore, he could not bring himself to reconcile with her. But Olga didn't want anything to spoil her perfect birthday, so she quickly changed the subject. And within a few minutes, Joe was laughing again. Around 1:30 a.m., Joe pulled his car into a parking spot in front of his and Olga's condo. Olga got out of the car and headed down the walkway towards their front door. Joe moved kind of slowly and trailed behind her. Olga pulled her keys out of her purse, and right as she was about to unlock the door, she heard a strange noise coming from behind her. Not long after that, Officer Kelly Richards of the Newcastle County Police Department got out of her cruiser and headed up the walkway towards Joe and Olga's condo. Just a few minutes earlier, emergency dispatch had been flooded with calls from people in the surrounding condos saying they had just heard gunshots, and one caller had been sure he could see a body. Richards was the first cop on the scene, but she saw paramedics crouched down by the front door of the condo, furiously trying to help someone who was on the ground. Richards approached, and she saw there was an unconscious blonde woman in a dress laying there. Blood was pouring from the woman's cheek and head onto the concrete, and Richards thought it looked like she'd been shot. The woman was still breathing, though, but just barely. Richards saw there was a ring with several diamonds in it on the woman's finger. So Richards' first thought was that the attacker must not have been here to rob this woman. Officer Richards saw more paramedics rushing down the walkway with a gurney, so she moved out of the way. But as Richards watched the paramedics wheel this woman to a nearby ambulance, she realized something strange. Richards knew this woman. Suddenly, Officer Richards looked around and really took in the condo and the surrounding area, and then it hit her. This woman, who was being rushed to the hospital, was Olga Connell. Less than 2 months earlier, Officer Richards had worked a burglary case at this condo because someone had broken in and stolen a bunch of Olga's expensive jewelry. Just then, Richards heard cars screech to a stop in the parking lot, and it sort of snapped her out of her daze. She saw several police officers coming her way, looking at her expectantly, and she told them they needed to do a sweep of the area. And it didn't take long before Richards heard one of the officers calling her name. She saw the officer crouching down near some bushes a few yards away from the front door, and so Richards walked over and joined the officer. And there, half hidden by the bushes, she saw the body of a man who had been shot multiple times, and it was clear he was already dead. Officer Richards knelt down and shined her flashlight to get a clear look at the man's face, and right away she recognized him too. This was Olga's husband, Joe. Officer Richards had met with him several times during that burglary investigation. Around this time, Officer Richards looked over and saw the lead investigator, Detective Jamie Leonard, getting out of his car. Richards got up and walked over to him, but before she could say anything, Detective Leonard told her that he'd just gotten news that the woman who'd been found at the scene here had died on the way to the hospital. So they were now dealing with what looked like a double homicide. Officer Richards said she knew both victims. Their names were Olga and Joe Connell, and their condo had actually been robbed back in July. But Richards said that wasn't all. While the police had never arrested anyone in connection with that robbery, Joe Connell had suspected he knew who robbed them. And police had even interviewed this person. It was Joe's own little sister, Kelly. That afternoon, Detective Leonard sat at his desk looking over crime scene photos, waiting for Joe's sister, Kelly, to get to the station. And as he looked at photos of Olga laying by the front door and Joe laying several yards away in the bushes, he had a theory that he just couldn't shake. Leonard had spent the entire morning with Officer Richards and a few others combing the area around the condo, and a couple of things had stood out to him. The first was that the bushes where Joe's body had been found were littered with 9mm bullet casings. However, they also found .22 caliber casings on site, and the report Leonard had received from the hospital where Olga had been taken stated that her bullet wounds had come from a .22. Now, Leonard knew it was possible that the killer could have just had two different guns on them. But based on how far apart the bodies had been found, he thought it was more likely that there had been two shooters at the scene, one to kill Olga and one to kill Joe. And if that was the case, Leonard thought there was a good chance that these murders had been planned, and that they were not the result of some kind of spur-of-the-moment argument or anything like that. Detective Leonard's door opened, and an officer stepped inside. He told Leonard that Joe's sister Kelly had just arrived and was waiting in one of the interview rooms. Leonard put the crime scene photos back in a folder, put on his suit jacket, and then walked out of his office. Detective Leonard reached the interview room, went inside, and sat down at a table across from Kelly. And right away, his first impression was she looked like she hadn't slept all night. Joe and Olga's immediate families had all been informed about the murders. But since Olga's family was in Russia, Joe's parents and his two siblings were the ones dealing directly with the police. And Leonard knew that could take a toll on someone. So he started the interview with what he thought was a simple question. What was Kelly's relationship with her brother Joe like? But just hearing this question sent Kelly into a total breakdown. She began sobbing and she struggled to catch her breath. She said that she and Joe had actually been fighting and had stopped talking to each other. But now he was dead, and so she'd never get a chance to talk to him again. Detective Leonard just sat there quietly and let Kelly cry for a few minutes. As far as he could tell, Kelly was truly upset about the death of her brother. But Leonard also knew that didn't necessarily mean she was totally innocent. When Kelly finally composed herself and said she was okay to continue, Detective Leonard laid everything out. He told her he knew about the burglary at Joe and Olga's condo, and he knew she, Kelly, had been interviewed by police in connection to that crime. He also assumed that that's why she and her brother had stopped talking to each other. But Kelly said no, that her and Joe had actually started fighting before all that. And then Kelly leaned forward and began telling her story. And as she did, Detective Leonard just sat there thinking, this sounds totally insane. Kelly told the detective that years ago, her mother had given her the most beautiful ring with a bunch of diamonds in it. The ring was a family heirloom, and her mom had wanted to pass it on to her only daughter. Kelly had treasured this ring and dreamed of it being her engagement ring someday. Then, a few months ago, Kelly's mother had asked if she could borrow the ring so she could wear it on a trip she was taking. Kelly said of course, After all, it had been her mother's ring for a long time before Kelly got it. However, when her mom had returned the ring, Kelly knew right away that something was wrong. The ring looked different. So, on a hunch, Kelly had brought the ring to a jeweler, and the jeweler said there were no diamonds in this ring. There were only cubic zirconias. Cubic zirconias are cheaper stones that are often used to imitate diamonds. Kelly told Detective Leonard that she'd been really confused at first. But pretty soon, everything clicked when she heard that Joe had given Olga this beautiful engagement ring with several diamonds in it. And so Kelly got in touch with Olga, wanting to know if those diamonds had come from her family heirloom ring. Olga had said she had no idea what Kelly was talking about, but it hadn't taken long for Kelly to get her mom and Joe to admit what they had done. They had taken the diamonds out of Kelly's ring when she lent it to her mother, put those diamonds in a new ring for Olga, and put cubic zirconias in the original, gave it back to Kelly, and just hoped Kelly wouldn't notice. At this point, Kelly stopped talking. And at first, Detective Leonard really didn't know what to say. This was like the plot twist of a heist movie or something. But he quickly got back on track. He asked point blank if Kelly had broken into Joe and Olga's condo to try to steal the diamonds back, or to steal other jewelry to get back at Joe for what he'd done. At this point, Kelly broke down again. She said she had nothing to do with the burglary. And as angry as she was, Joe was still her brother, and she loved him. Leonard wrapped up the interview by asking Kelly where she had been when Joe and Olga had been killed. And Kelly said she'd been home alone. She knew that was not a great alibi, but it was the truth. After the interview ended, Leonard considered Kelly to be a major suspect, but he didn't have any concrete evidence to hold her, so he had to let her go. The detective had not slept in a while, but he had no intention of stopping anytime soon. And after Kelly's crazy story, he wanted to talk to someone outside of the family about Joe, someone who would not have been mixed up in the family feud and who hadn't swiped any diamonds. So Leonard headed across town to Joe's auto repair shop. Later that afternoon, still not even 24 hours after Joe and Olga's bodies had been found, Detective Leonard walked across the parking lot of the auto repair shop that Joe had co-owned. He saw several mechanics hard at work on different cars, and he also saw a few guys who looked like they'd just come by the shop to hang out. They seemed a little strange to Leonard, but he didn't think too much about it. He walked into a small lobby, and he saw a man who looked like he was around 30 sitting behind the counter. Detective Leonard introduced himself and showed his badge, and the man behind the counter stood up. He said his name was Chris Rivers, and he asked if there was a problem. Leonard asked him if he knew who Joe Connell was. Immediately, Chris let out a big sigh, and a very annoyed look came across his face. He looked right at Leonard and said, "What did he do now?" This was not what the detective had expected. In fact, it really threw him off. Leonard had planned to come by the shop, learn a bit about Joe, and then leave. But now, he wondered if Chris might have information about something illegal Joe had been mixed up in. So, right there on the spot, Leonard changed his plan, and he asked Chris if he wouldn't mind coming to the station to answer some questions. The sun had begun to set by the time Detective Leonard and Chris sat down together inside of an interview room. Based on what Chris had said at the auto repair shop, it seemed like he had no idea Joe had been killed, and Leonard didn't tell him. Instead, the detective asked Chris what he did at the auto repair shop. Chris said he co-owned the place with Joe, but sometimes he felt like he was doing everything by himself. Leonard asked him to elaborate, and so Chris said, Joe seemed to like the idea of owning the business way more than actually running the business. Leonard smiled like he could relate, and he asked Chris if Joe's behavior upset him. Chris said of course it did. It was hard enough keeping the shop open, let alone profitable. But suddenly, Chris stopped talking and just stared at Detective Leonard. Chris realized he'd just started ranting and still had no idea why he was there. So he asked again, what had Joe done? At this point, Detective Leonard knew he had to tell Chris what